I'm just gonna send people this thing because they told me to. Okay, there we go. I'll be on in a bit. Hold on. Okay. Neat. I will begin right now. Have these two things of water to so I don't die. Okay. Start from chapter 1. Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing an Amalinze the cat. Amalinze was the great wrestler who for 7 years was unbeaten, from Umuofia to Mbano. He was called the cat because his back would never touch the earth. It was this man that Okonkwo threw in a fight, which the old men agreed was one of the fiercest since the founder of their town engaged the spirit of the wild for 7 days and 7 nights. The drums beat and the flutes sang, and the spectators held their breath. Amalinze was a wily craftsman, but Okonkwo was as slippery as a fish in water. Every nerve and every muscle stood out on their arms, on their backs and their thighs, and one almost heard them stretching to breaking point. In the end, Okonkwo threw the cat. That was many years ago, 20 years or more, and during this time, Okonkwo's fame had grown like the bushfire in the Harmattan. He was tall and huge, and his bushy eyebrows and wide nose gave him a very severe look. He breathed heavily, and it was said that when he slept, his wives and children in their houses could hear him breathe. When he walked, his heels hardly touched the ground, and he seemed to walk on springs, as if he was going to pounce on somebody. And he did pounce on people quite often. He had a slight stammer, and whenever he was angry and could not get his words out quickly enough, he would use his fists. He had no patience with unsuccessful men. He had no patience with his father. Unoka, for that was his father's name, had died 10 years ago. In his day, he was lazy and improvident and was quite incapable of thinking about tomorrow. If any money came his way, it seldom did. He immediately brought gourds of palm wine, called around his neighbors, and made merry. He always said that whenever he saw a dead man's mouth, he saw the folly of not eating what one had in one's lifetime. Unoka was, of course, a debtor, and he owed every neighbor some money, from a few cowries to quite substantial amounts. He was tall but very thin, and had a slight stoop. He wore a haggard and mournful look, except when he was drinking or playing on his flute. He was very good on his flute, and his happiest moments were the 2 or 3 moons after the harvest, when the village musicians brought down their instruments hung above the fireplace. Unoka would play with them, his face beaming with blessedness and peace. Sometimes another village would ask Unoka's band and their dancing Agwuruwu to come and stay with them and teach them their tunes. They would go to such hosts for as long as 3 or 4 markets, making music and feasting. Unoka loved the good fare and the good fellowship, and he loved the season of the year when the rains had stopped and the sun rose every morning with a dazzling beauty. And it was not too hot either, because the cold and dry Harmattan wind was blowing down from the north. Some years the Harmattan was very severe, and a dense haze hung on the atmosphere. Old men and children would then sing around log fires, warming their bodies. Unoka loved it all, and he loved the first kites that returned with a dry season, and the children who sang songs of welcome to them. He would remember his own childhood, how he had often wandered around looking for a kite sailing leisurely against the blue sky. As soon as he found one, he would sing with his whole being, welcoming it back from its long, long journey, asking it if it had brought home any lengths of cloth. That was years ago when he was young. Unoka, the grown-up, was a failure. He was poor and his wife and children had barely enough to eat. People laughed at him because he was a loafer, and they swore never to lend him any more money because he never paid back. But Unoka was such a man that he always succeeded in borrowing more and piling up his debts. One day, a neighbor called Okoye came in to see him. He was reclining on a bed a mud bed in his hut playing on the flute. He immediately rose and shook hands with Okoye, who then unrolled the goatskin which he carried under his arm and sat down. Yunoko went into an inner room and soon returned with a small wooden disc containing the cola nut, some alligator pepper, and a lump of white chalk. I have cola, he announced when he sat down, and passed the disc over to his guest. Thank you. He who brings cola brings life. But I think you ought to break it, replied Okoye, passing back the disc. No, it is for you, I think. They argued like this for a few moments before Yunoka accepted the honor of breaking the cola. Okoye, meanwhile, took the lump of chalk, drew some lines on the floor, and then painted his big toe. As he broke the cola, Yunoka prayed to their ancestors for life and health, and for protection against their enemies. When they had eaten, they talked about many things, about the heavy rains which were drowning the yams, about the next ancestral feasts, and about the impending war with the village of Mbino. Yunoka was never happy when it came to wars. He was in fact a coward and could not bear the sight of blood, and so he changed the subject and talked about music, and his face beamed. He could hear in his mind's ear the blood-stirring and intricate rhythms of the ekwe and the udu and the ogene, and he could hear his own flute weaving in and out of them, decorating them with a colorful and plaintive tune. The total effect was gay and brisk, but if one picked out the flute as it went up and down and then broke up into short snatches, one saw that there was sorrow and grief there. Okoye was also a musician. He played on the ogene, but he was not a failure like Yunoka. He had a large barn full of yams and had 3 wives. And now he was going to take the Edemili title, the 3rd highest in the land. It was a very expensive ceremony, and he was gathering all his resources together. That was in fact the reason why he had come with Yunoka. He cleared his throat and began, "Thank you for the cola. You may have heard the title I intend to take shortly." Having spoken plainly so far, Okoye said the next half a dozen sentences in Proverbs. Among the Igbo, the art of conversation is regarded very highly, and Proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. Okoye was a great talker, and he spoke for a very long time, skirting around the subject and then hitting it finally. In short, he was asking Yunoka to return the 200 cowries he had borrowed from him more than 2 years before. As soon as Yunoka understood what his friend was driving at, he burst out laughing. He laughed loud and long, and his voice rang out clear as the ogene, and tears stood in his eyes. His visitor was amazed and sat speechless. At the end, Yunoka was able to give an answer between fresh outbursts of mirth. "Look at that wall," he said, pointing at the far wall of his hut, which was rubbed with red earth so that it shone. "Look at those lines of chalk." And Okoye saw the groups of short, perpendicular lines drawn in chalk. There were 5 groups, and the smallest group had 10 lines. Yunoka had a sense of dramatic, and so he allowed a pause, in which he took a pinch of snuff and sneezed noisily. Then he continued, "Each group there represents a debt to someone, and each stroke is 100 cowries. You see, I owe that man 1,000 cowries, but he has not come to wake me up in the morning for it. I shall pay you, but not today. Our elders say that the sun will shine on those who stand before it shines on those who kneel under them. I shall pay for my big debts first." And he took another pinch of snuff, as if that was paying the big debts first. Okoye rolled his goatskin and departed. When Yunoka died, he had taken no title at all, and he was heavily in debt. Any wonder then that his son Okonkwo was ashamed of him? Fortunately, among those people was a man was judged according to his worth and not according to the worth of his father. Okonkwo was clearly cut out for great things. He was still young, but he had won the fame as the greatest wrestler in the 9 villages. He was a wealthy farmer and had 2 barns full of yams, and had just married his 3rd wife. To crown it all, he had taken 2 titles and had shown incredible prowess in 2 intertribal wars. And so, although Okonkwo was still young, he was already one of the greatest men of his time. Age was respected among his people, but his achievements was revered. As the elders said, if a child washed his hands, he could eat with kings. Okonkwo had clearly washed his hands, and so he ate with kings and elders. And that was how he came to look under the doomed lad who was sacrificed to the village of Eumofia by their neighbors to avoid war and bloodshed. The ill-fated lad was called Ikemufuna. Ikemefuna. I'm already tired. Page 9. Chapter 2. Okonkwo was just blown out the palm oil lamp and stretched himself on his bamboo bed when he heard the Ojin of his town crier piercing the still night air. Go man, go man, go man, go man, booms the hollow metal. Then the crier gave his message, and at the end of it beat his instrument again. And this was the message. Every man of Eumofia was asked to gather at the marketplace tomorrow morning. Okonkwo wondered that what was amiss, for he knew certainly that something was amiss. He had discerned a clear overtone of tragedy in the crier's voice, and even now he could still hear it as it grew dimmer and dimmer in the distance. The night was very quiet. It was always quiet except on moonlight nights. Darkness held a vague terror for those people, even the bravest among them. Children were warned not to whistle at night for fear of evil spirits. Dangerous animals became even more sinister and uncanny in the dark. A snake was never called by its name at night because it would hear. It was called a string. And so upon this particular night, as the crier's voice was gradually swallowed up in the distance, a silence returned to the world, a vibrant silence made more intense by the universal trill of a million forest insects. On a moonlight night, it would be different. The happy voices of children playing in the open fields would then be heard, and perhaps not those not so young would be playing in pairs in less open spaces, and old men and women would remember their youth. As the Igbo say, when the moon is shining, the cripple becomes hungry for a walk. But this particular night was dark and silent, and in all the 9 villages, the Eumofia, a town crier with his Ojin asked every man to be present tomorrow morning. Okonkwo, on his bamboo bed, tried to figure out the nature of the emergency. War with a neighboring clan? That seemed the most likely reason, and he was not afraid of war. He was a man of action, a man of war. Unlike his father, he could stand the look of blood. In Eumofia's latest war, he was the first to bring home a human head. That was his 5th head, and he was not an old man yet. On great occasions, such as the funeral of a village celebrity, he drank his palm wine from his first human head. Thank you. In the morning, the marketplace was full. There must have been about 10,000 men there, all talking in low voices. At last, Ogbuefi Ezeugo stood in the midst of them and bellowed 4 times, Eumofia Kwenu. And on each occasion, he had faced a different direction and seemed to push the air with a clenched fist. And 10,000 men answered, Yai! Each time. Then there was perfect silence. Ogbuefi Ezeugo was a powerful orator and was always chosen to speak on such occasions. He moved his hand over his white head and stroked his white beard. He then adjusted his cloth, which was passed under his right arm and tied above his left shoulder. Eumofia Kwenu, he bellowed a 5th time, and the crowd yelled in answer. And then suddenly, like one possessed, he shot out his left hand and pointed in the direction of Mebeno, and said through the gleaming white teeth firmly clenched, Those sons of wild animals have dared to murder a daughter of Eumofia. He threw his head down and gnashed his teeth, and allowed a murmur of suppressed anger to sweep the crowd. When he began again, the anger on his face was gone, and in its place a sort of smile hovered, more terrible and more sinister than anger. And in clear, unemotional voice, he told Eumofia how their daughter had gone to the market as Mebeno had been killed. Yeah. That woman, said Ezeugo, was the wife of Ogbuefi Udo, and he pointed to a man who sat near him with a bowed head. The crowd then shouted with anger and thirst for blood. Many others spoke, and at the end it was decided to follow the normal course of action. An ultimatum was immediately dispatched to Meno, asking them to choose between war on one hand and on the other, the offer of a young man and a virgin of compensation. Eumofia was feared by all of its neighbors. It was powerful in war and in magic, and its priests and medicine men were feared in all the surrounding country. Its most potent war medicine was as old as the clan itself, Nobody knew how old. But on one point there was a general agreement. The active principle in that medicine had been an old woman with one leg. In fact, the medicine itself was called Agadi Nwai, or old woman. It had its shrine in the center of Eumofia, in a cleared spot. If anybody was so foolhardy as to pass by the shrine after dusk, he was sure to see the old woman hopping about. And so the neighboring clans who naturally knew of these things feared Eumofia and would not go to war against it without first trying a peaceful settlement. And in fairness to Eumofia, it should be recorded that it never went to war unless its case was clear and just and was accepted by its oracle. The oracle of the hills and the caves. Oh my gosh, this light hurts. Never mind, I needed to read. And there were indeed occasions when the oracle had forbidden Eumofia to wage a war. If the clan had disobeyed the oracle, they would surely have been beaten, because their dreaded Agadi Nwai would never fight what the Igbo call a fight of blame. But the war that now threatened was just a war. Even the enemy clan knew that. And so when Okonkwo of Eumofia arrived at Beno as the proud and imperious emissary of war, he was treated with great honor and respect. And 2 days later, he returned home with a lad of 15 and a young virgin. The lad's name was Ikemefuna, whose sad story is still told in Eumofia unto this day. The elders, or Ndishi, met to hear a report of Okonkwo's mission. At the end, they decided, as everybody knew they would, that a girl should go to Ogbuefi Udo to replace his murdered wife. As for the boy, he belonged to the clan as a whole, and there was no hurry to decide his fate. Okonkwo was, therefore, asked on behalf of the clan to look after him in the interim. And so for 3 years, Ikemefuna lived in Okonkwo's household. Okonkwo ruled his household with a heavy hand. His wives, especially the youngest, lived in perpetual fear of his fiery temper, and so did his little children. Perhaps down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear, the fear of failure and of weakness. It was deeper and more intimate than the fear of evil and capricious gods and of magic. The fear of the forest and of the forces of nature, malevolent, red in tooth and claw. Okonkwo's fear was greater than these. It was not external, but lay deep within himself. It was the fear of himself, lest he should be found to resemble his father. Even as a little boy, he had resented his father's failure and weakness, and even now he had still remembered how he suffered when a playmate told him that his father was Agbala. That was how Okonkwo first came to know that Agbala was not only another name for a woman, it could also mean a man who had taken no title. And so Okonkwo was ruled by one passion, to hate everything that his father Unoka had loved. One of those things was gentleness, and another was idleness. During that planting season, Okonkwo worked daily on his farms from cockcrow until the chickens went to roost. He was a very strong man and rarely felt fatigue, but his wives and young children were not as strong, and so they suffered. But they dared not complain openly. Okonkwo's first son, Nwoye, was then 12 years old, but was already causing his father great anxiety for his incipient laziness. At any rate, that was how it looked to his father, and he sought to correct him by constant nagging and beating. And so Nwoye was developing into a sad-faced youth. Okonkwo's prosperity was visible in his household. He had a large compound enclosed by a thick wall of red earth. His own hut, or obi, stood immediately behind the only gate in the red walls. Each of his 3 wives had her own hut, which together formed a half-moon behind the obi. The barn was built against one end of the red walls, and long stacks of yams stood up preposterously in it. At the opposite end was a compound was a shed for the goats, and each wife built a small attachment to her hut for the hens. Near the barns was a small house, the medicine house, or shrine where Okonkwo kept the wooden symbols of his personal god and of his ancestral spirits. He worshipped them with sacrifices of kola nut, food, and palm wine, and offered prayers to them on behalf of himself, his 3 wives, and 8 children. So when the daughter of Eumofia was killed in Beno, Ikemefuna came into Okonkwo's household. When Okonkwo brought him home that day, he called his most senior wife, and handed him over to her. He belongs to the clan, he told her, so look after him. Is he staying long with us? She asked. Do what you are told, woman, Okonkwo thundered and stammered. When did you become one of the Ndisha of Imofia? And so, Nuoya's mother took Ikemefuna to her hut and asked no more questions. As for the boy himself, he was terribly afraid. He could not understand what was happening to him or what he had done. How could he know that his father had taken a hand in killing a daughter of Imofia? Only knew that a few men had arrived at their house, conversing with his father in low tones, and at the end he had been taken out and handed over to a stranger. His mother had wept bitterly, but he had been too surprised to weep, and so the stranger had brought him and a girl a long, long way from home, though lonely forest paths. He did not know who the girl was, and he never saw her again. Chapter 3. Okonkwo did not have the start in life which many young men usually had. He did not inherit a barn from his father. There was no barn to inherit. The story was told in Umofia of how his father, Unoka, had gone to consult the oracle of the hills and the caves to find out why he always had a miserable harvest. The oracle was called Agbala, and people came from far and near to consult it. They came when misfortune dogged their steps or when they had a dispute with their neighbors. They came to discover what the future held for them or to consult the spirits of their departed fathers. The way into the shrine was a round hole at the side of the hill, just a little bigger than the round opening into a henhouse. Worshippers and those who came to seek knowledge from the god crawled onto the belly through a hole and found themselves in a dark, endless space in the presence of Agbala. No one had ever beheld Agbala except his priestess, but no one who had ever called into his awful shrine had come out with the fear of his power. His priestess stood by the sacred fire which she built in the heart of the cave and proclaimed the will of the god. The fire did not burn with a flame. The glowing logs only served to light vaguely the dark figure of the priestess. Sometimes a man came to consult the spirit of his dead father or relative. It was said that when such a spirit appeared, the man saw it vaguely in the darkness, but never heard its voice. Some people even said that they had heard the spirits flying and flapping their wings against the roof of the cave. Many years ago, when Okonkwo was still a boy, his father, Unoka, had gone to consult Agbala. The priestess in those days was a woman called Chika. She was full of the power of her god, and she was greatly feared. Unoka stood before her and began his story. Every year, he said sadly, before I put any crop in the earth, I sacrifice a cock to Ani, the owner of all land. It is the law of our fathers. I also kill a cock at the shrine of Ifejioku, the god of yams. I clear the bush and set fire to it when it is dry. I sow the yams when the first rain has fallen, and stake them when the young tendrils appear. I weed. Hold your peace, screamed the priestess, her voice terrible as it echoed through the dark void. You have offended neither the gods nor your fathers. And when a man is at peace with his gods and his ancestors, his harvest will be good or bad according to the strength of his arm. You, Unoka, are known in all the clan for your weakness of your machete and your hoe. When your neighbors go out with their axe to cut down virgin forests, you sow the yams on exhausted farms that take no labor to clear. They cross 7 rivers to make their farms. You stay at home and offer sacrifices to a reluctant soil. Go home and work like a man. Unoka was an ill-fated man. He had a bad chi, or personal god, and evil fortune followed him to the grave, or rather to his death, for he had no grave. He died of the swelling, which was an abomination to the earth goddess. When a man was afflicted with swelling in the stomach and the limbs, he was not allowed to die in the house. He was carried to the evil forest and left there to die. There was the story of a very stubborn man who staggered back to his house and had been carried again to the forest and tied to a tree. The sickness was an abomination to the earth, and so the victim could not be buried in their bowels. He died and rotted away above the earth and was not given the first or the second burial. Such was Unoka's fate. When they carried him away, he took with him his flute. Thank you, Glennis. With a father like Unoka, Okonkwo did not have the start in life which many young men had. He neither inherited a barn, nor a title, nor even a young wife. But in spite of these disadvantages, he had begun even in his father's lifetime to lay the foundations of a prosperous future. It was slow and painful, but he threw himself into it like one possessed. And indeed, he was possessed by his fear of his father's contemptible life and shameful death. There was a wealthy man in Okonkwo's village who had 30 huge barns, 9 wives, and 30 children. His name was Nwakibi, and he had taken the highest but one title which a man could take in the clan. It was for this man that Okonkwo worked to earn his first seed yams. He took a pot of palm wine and a cock to Nwakibi. 2 elderly neighbors were sent for, and Nwakibi's 2 grown-up sons were also present in his obi. He presented a kola nut and an alligator pepper, which were passed around for all to see, and then returned to him. He broke the nut, saying, "We shall all live. We pray for life, children, a good harvest and happiness. You will have what is good for you, and I will have what is good for me. Let the kite perch, and let the eagle perch too. If one says no to the other, let his wing break." After the kola nut had been eaten, Okonkwo brought his palm wine from the corner of the hut where it had been placed, and stood it in the center of the group. He addressed Nwakibi, calling him, "Our father." "Na-ayi," he said, "I have brought you this little kola. As our people say, a man who pays respects the great paves the way for his own greatness. I have come to pay you my respects and also to ask a favor. But let us drink the wine first." Everybody thanked Okonkwo, and the neighbors brought out their drinking horns from their goatskin bags they carried. Nwakibi brought down his own horn, which was fastened to the rafters. The younger of his sons, who was also the youngest man in the group, moved to the center, raised the pot on his left knee, and began to pour out the wine. The first cup went to Okonkwo, who must taste his wine before anyone else. Then the group drank, beginning with the eldest man. When everyone had drunk 2 or 3 horns, Nwabiki sent for his wives. Some of them were not at home, and only 4 came in. "Is Anasinat in?" he asked them. They said she was coming. Anasi was the first wife, and the others could not drink before her, and so they stood waiting. Anasi was a middle-aged woman, tall and strongly built. There was authority in her bearing, and she looked every inch the ruler of the womenfolk in a large and prosperous family. She wore the anklet of her husband's titles, which the first wife alone could wear. She walked up to her husband and accepted the horn from him. She then went down on one knee and drank a little and handed back the horn. She rose, calling him by his name, and went back to her hut. The other wives drank in the same way, in their proper order, and went away. The men then counted their drinking and talking. Ogbuefi Idigo was talking about the palm wine tapper, Obiako, who suddenly gave up his trade. "There must be something behind it," he said, wiping the foam of wine from his mustache with the back of his left hand. "There must be a reason for it. A toad does not run in the daytime for nothing. You can ask your questions." Oh, thank you. "Some people say the oracle warned him that he would fall off a palm tree and kill himself," said Kukolia. "Obiako had always been a strange one," said Nwakibi. "I've heard that many years ago, when his father had not been dead very long, he had gone to consult the oracle. The oracle said to him, 'Your dead father wants you to sacrifice a goat to him.' Do you know what he told the oracle? He said, 'Ask my dead father if he ever had a fowl when he was alive.'" Everybody laughed heartily except Okonkwo, who laughed uneasily because, as the saying goes, an old woman is always uneasy when dry bones are mentioned in the proverb. Okonkwo remembered his own father. At last the young man who was pouring out the wine held up half a horn of the thick, white dregs and said, What we are eating is finished. We have seen it. The others replied. Who will drink the dregs? He asked. Whoever has a job in hand, said Idigo, looking at Nwakibi's elder son, Iguelo, with a malicious twinkle in his eyes. In his eye. Everybody agreed that Iguelo should drink the dregs. He accepted the half-full horn from his brother and drank it. As Idigo said, Iguelo had a job in hand because he had married his first wife a month or two before. The thick dregs of palm wine were supposed to be good for men who were going into their wives. After the wine had been drunk, Okonkwo laid his difficulties before Nwakibi. I have come to you for help, he said. Perhaps you can already guess what it is. I had cleared a farm, but had no yams to sow. I know what it is to ask a man to trust another with his yams, especially these days when the young men are afraid of hard work. I am not afraid of work. The lizard that jumped from the high Iroko tree to the ground said he would praise himself if no one else did. I began to fend for myself at an age when most people still stuck to their mother's breasts. If you give me some yam seeds, I shall not fail you. Nwakibi cleared his throat. It pleases me to see a young man like you these days when our youth has gone so soft. Many young men have come to me to ask for yams, but I have refused because I knew that they would just dump them in the earth and leave them to be choked by weeds. When I say no to them, they think I am hard-hearted, but it is not so. Iniki the bird says that since man had learned to shoot without missing, he has learned to fly without perching. I have learned to be stingy with my yams, but I can trust you. I know it as I looked at you. As our father said, you can tell a ripe corn by its look. I shall give you twice 400 yams. Go ahead and prepare your farm. 30 minutes in. Okonkwo thanked him again and went home feeling happy. He knew that Nwakibi would not refuse him, but he had not expected he would be so generous. He had not hoped to get more than 400 seeds. He would now have to make a bigger farm. He hoped to get another 400 yams from one of his father's friends at Iziuso. Sharecropping was a very slow way of building up a barn of one's own. After all the toil, one only got a third of the harvest. But for a young man whose father had no yams, there was no other way. And what made worse in Okonkwo's case was that he had to support his mother and his two sisters from his meager harvest. And supporting his mother also meant supporting his father. She could not be expected to cook and eat while her husband starved. And so at a very early age, when he was striving desperately to build a barn and through the sharecropping, Okonkwo was also fending for his father's house. It was like pouring grains of corn into a bag full of holes. His mother and sisters worked hard enough, but they grew women's crops like cocoa yams, beans, and cassava. Yam, the king of crops, was a man's crop. The year that Okonkwo took 800 seed yams from Nwakibi was the worst year in living memory. Nothing, it seems, had happened. Nothing happened at its proper time. It was either too early or too late. It seems as if the world had gone mad. The first rains were late, and when they came, lasted only a brief moment. The blazing sun returned, more fierce than it had ever been known, and it scorched all the green that had appeared with the rains. The earth burned like hot coals and roasted all the yams that had been sown. Like all good farmers, Okonkwo had begun to sow with the first rains. He had sown 400 seeds when the rain dried up and the heat returned. He watched the sky all day for the signs of rain clouds and lay awake all night. In the morning, he went back to his farm and saw the withering tendrils. He had tried to protect them from the smoldering earth by making rings of thick sisal leaves around them. But in the end of the day, the sisal rings were burned dry and gray. He changed them every day and prayed that the rain might fall in the night. But the drought continued for 8 market weeks, and the yams were killed. Some farmers had not planted their yams yet. They were the lazy, easygoing ones who would always put off clearing their farms as long as they could. This year, they were the wise ones. They sympathized with their neighbors with much shaking of the head, but inwardly they were happy for what they took to be their own foresight. Okonkwo planted what was left of his seed yams when the rains finally returned. He had one consolation. The yams he had sown before the drought were his own, the harvest of the previous year. He still had the 800 from Noakivi and the 400 from his father's friend, so he would make a fresh start. But the year had gone mad. Rain fell as had never fallen before. For days and nights together it poured in the violent torrents and washed away the yam heaps. Trees were uprooted and deep gorges appeared everywhere. Then the rain became less violent, but it went from day to day without a pause. The spell of sunshine, which always came in the middle of the wet season, did not appear. The yams put on luxuriant green leaves, but every farmer knew that without sunshine, the tubers would not grow. That year, the harvest was sad, like a funeral, and many farmers wept as they dug up the miserable and rotting yams. One man tied his cloth to a tree branch and hanged himself. Okonkwo remembered that tragic year with a cold shiver throughout the rest of his life. It was always surprised him when he thought of it later and that he did not sink under the load of despair. He knew that he was a fierce fighter, but that year had been enough to break up the heart of a lion. Since I survived that year, he always said, I shall survive anything. He put down his inflexible will. His father, Unoka, who was then an ailing man, had said to him during the terrible harvest month, do not despair. I know you will not despair. You have a manly and a proud heart. A proud heart can survive a general failure because a failure does not prick its pride. It is more difficult and more bitter when a man feels alone. Unoko was like that in his last days. His love of talk had grown with age and sickness. It tried Okonkwo's patience beyond words. Chapter 4. Looking at a king's mouth, said an old man, one would think he'd never sucked at his mother's breast. He was talking about Okonkwo, who had risen so suddenly from great poverty and misfortune to be one of the lords of the clan. The old man bore no ill will towards Okonkwo. Indeed, he respected him for his industry and success. But he was struck, as most people were, by Okonkwo's brusqueness in dealing with less successful men. Only a week ago, the man had contradicted him at a kindred meeting, which they held to discuss the next ancestral feast. Without looking at the man, Okonkwo had said, this meeting is for men. The man who had contradicted him had no titles. That was why he had called him a woman. Okonkwo knew how to kill a man's spirit. Everybody at the kindred meeting took sides with Osugo when Okonkwo called him a woman. The oldest man present said sternly that those whose palm kernels were cracked for them by benevolent spirits should not forget to be humble. Okonkwo said he was sorry for what he had said, and the meeting continued. But it really was not true that Okonkwo's palm kernels had been cracked for him by a benevolent spirit. He had cracked them himself. Anyone who knew his grim struggle against poverty and misfortune cannot say that he had been lucky. If ever a man deserved his success, the man was Okonkwo. At an early age, he had achieved fame as the greatest wrestler in all the land. That was not luck. At the most, one could say that it was his chi, or a personal god was good. But the Igbo people had a proverb that when a man says yes, his chi says yes also. Okonkwo says yes very strongly, so his chi agreed. And not only his chi, but his clan too, because it judged the man by the work of his hands. That was why Okonkwo had been chosen by the 9 villages to carry a message of war to their enemies, unless they agreed to give up a young man and their virgin to atone for the murder of Udo's wife. And such was the deep fear that their enemies had for Umofia that they treated Okonkwo like a king and brought him a virgin who was still to Udo as wife, and the lad Ikemefuna. The elders of the clan had decided that Ikemefuna should be in Okonkwo's care for a while, but no one thought it would be as long as 3 years. They seemed to forget all about him as soon as they had taken the decision. At first, Ikemefuna was very much afraid. Once or twice he had tried to run away, but he did not know where to begin. He thought of his mother and his 3-year-old sister and wept bitterly. Nuoya's mother was very kind to him and treated him as one of her own children. But all he said was, "When shall I go home?" When Okonkwo heard that he would not eat any food, he came into the hut with a big stick in his hand and stood over him while he swallowed his yams, trembling. A few moments later, he went behind the hut and began to vomit painfully. Noya's mother went to him and placed her hands on his chest and on his back. He was ill for 3 market weeks, and when he recovered, he seemed to have overcome his great fear and sadness. He was by nature a very lively boy, and he gradually became popular with Okonkwo's household, especially with the two children. Okonkwo's son, Noye, who was 2 years younger, became quite inseparable from him because he seemed to know everything. He could fashion out flutes from bamboo stems and even from the elephant grass. He knew the names of all the birds and could set clever traps for the little bush rodents. And he knew which trees made the strongest bows. Even Okonkwo himself became very fond of the boy, inwardly, of course. Okonkwo never showed any emotion openly, unless it be the emotion of anger. To show affection was a sign of weakness, the only thing worth demonstrating with strength. He was therefore treated he therefore treated Ikemefuna as he treated everyone else, with a heavy hand. But there was no doubt that he liked the boy. Sometimes when he went to the big village meetings or communal ancestral feasts, he allowed Ikemefuna to accompany him like a son, carrying his stool and his great goatskin bag. And indeed, Ikemefuna called him father. Ikemefuna came to Umofia at the end of the carefree season between the harvest and planting. In fact, he recovered from his illness only a few days before the week of peace began. And that was also the year Okonkwo broke the peace and was punished, as was the custom, by Izani, the priest of the earth goddess. Okonkwo was provoked to justifiable anger by his youngest wife, who went to plait her hair at her friend's house and did not return early enough to cook the afternoon meal. Okonkwo did not know at first that she was not at home. After waiting in vain for her dish, he went to her hut to see what she was doing. There was nobody in the hut, and the fireplace was cold. "Where's Ojiugo?" he asked his second wife, who came out of her hut to draw water from a gigantic pot in the shade of a small tree in the middle of the compound. "She has gone to plait her hair." Okonkwo bit his lips in anger, as anger welled up within him. "Where are her children? Did she take them?" he asked with unusual coolness and restraint. They are here," answered his first wife, Noye's mother. Okonkwo bent down and looked into her hut. Ojiugo's children were eating with the children of his first wife. "Did she ask you to feed them before she went?" "Yes," lied Noye's mother, trying to minimize Ojiugo's thoughtlessness. Okonkwo knew that she was not speaking the truth. He walked back to his obi to await Ojiugo's return. And when she returned, he beat her very heavily. In his anger, he had forgotten that it was the week of peace. His first two wives ran out in great alarm, pleading with him that it was the sacred week. But Okonkwo was not the man to stop beating someone halfway through, not even for fear of the goddess. Okonkwo's neighbors heard his wife crying and sent their voices over their compound walls to ask what was the matter. Some of them came over to see for themselves. It was unheard of to beat someone during the sacred week. Before it was dusk, Izani, who was the priest of his earth goddess, Ani, called on Okonkwo on his obi. Okonkwo brought out kola nut and placed it before the priest. "Take away your kola nut. I shall not eat in the house of a man who has no respect for our gods and ancestors." Okonkwo tried to explain to him that what his wife had done, but Izani seemed to pay no attention. He held a short staff in his hand, which he brought down on the floor to emphasize his point. "Listen to me," he said when Okonkwo had spoken. "You are not a stranger in Umofia. You know as well as I do that our forefathers ordained that before we plant any crops in the earth, we should observe a week in which a man does not say a harsh word to his neighbor. We live in peace with our with our fellows to honor our great goddess of the earth, without whose blessing our crops will not grow. You have committed a great evil. He brought down his staff heavily on the floor. Your wife was at fault, but even if you came into your obi and found her lover on top of her, you would still have committed a great evil to beat her. His staff came down again. The evil you have done can ruin the whole clan. The earth goddess whom you have insulted may refuse to give us her increase, and we shall all perish. His tone now changed from anger to command. You will bring this to the shrine of Ani tomorrow, one she-goat, one hen, a length of cloth, and 100 cowries. He rose and left the hut. Okonkwo did as the priest said. He also took with him a pot of palm wine. Inwardly, he was repentant, but he was not the man to go about telling his neighbors that he was in error. And so his people said he had no respect for the gods of the clan. His enemies said his good fortune had gone to his head. They called him the little bird Nza, who so far forgot himself after a heavy meal that he was challenged by his chi. That he challenged his chi. No work was done during the week of peace. People called on their neighbors and drank palm wine. This year they talked of nothing else but the Nuso Ani, which Okonkwo had committed. It was the first time for many years that a man had broken the sacred peace. Even the oldest men could only remember one or two other occasions somewhere in the dim past. Oh my God. Ogbuefi Azedu, who was the oldest man in the village, was telling two other men who came to visit him that the punishment was for breaking the peace of Eni had become very mild in their clan. It was not always been so he said. My father told me that he had been told that in the past the man who broke the peace was dragged on the ground through the village until he died. But after a while, this custom was stopped because it spoiled the peace which it was meant to preserve. Somebody told me yesterday, said one of the younger men, that in some clans it is an abomination for a man to die during the week of peace. It is indeed true, said Ogbuefi Azudu. They have that custom in Obodoani. If a man dies at this time, he is not buried, but cast into the evil forest. It is a bad custom which these people observe because they lack understanding. They throw away large numbers of men and women without burial. And what is the result? Their clan is full of the evil spirits of these unburied dead, hungry to do harm of the living. After the week of peace, every man and his family began to clear the bush to make new farms. The cut bush was left to dry, and the fire was then set to it. As the smoke rose into the sky, kites appeared from different directions and hovered over the burning field in silent valediction. The rainy season was approaching when they would go away until the dry season returned. Okonkwo spent the next few days preparing his seed yams. He looked at each yam carefully to see whether it was good for sowing. Sometimes he decided that a yam was too big to be sown as one seed, and he split it deftly along its length with his sharp knife. His eldest son, Nwoye, and Ikemefuna helped him by fetching the yams in long baskets from the barn and in counting the prepared seeds in groups of 400. Sometimes Okonkwo gave them a few yams each to prepare, but he always found fault with their effort, and he said so much threatening. He says so with much threatening. Do you think you are cutting up yams for cooking? He asked Nwoye. If you split another yam of this size, I shall break your jaw. If you think you are still a child, I began to own a farm at your age. And you, he said to Ikemefuna, do not grow yams where you come from? Do you not grow yams where you come from? Inwardly, Okonkwo knew that the boys were still too young to understand fully the difficult art of preparing seed yams. But he thought that one could not begin too early. Yams stood for manliness, and he who could feed his family on yams from one harvest to another was a great man indeed. Okonkwo wanted his son to be a great farmer and a great man. He would stamp out the disquieting signs of laziness which he thought already saw in him. I will not have a son who cannot hold up his head in the gathering of the clan. I would sooner strangle him with my own hands. And if you stand staring at me like that, he swore, a Madiora will break your head for you. Some days later, when the land had been moistened by 2 or 3 heavy rains, Okonkwo and his family went to the farm with baskets of these seed yams, their hoes and machetes, and the planting began. They made single mounds of earth in straight lines all over the field and sowed the yams in them. Yam, the king of crops, was a very exacting king. For 3 or 4 moons, it demanded hard work and constant attention from Cockrow till the chickens went back to roost. The young tendrils were protected from earth heat with rings of sisal leaves. As the rains became heavier, the women planted maize, melons, and beans between the yam mounds. The yams were then staked, first with little sticks and later with tall and big tree branches. The women weeded the farms 3 times in definite periods in the life of yams, neither early nor late. And the rains had really come, so heavy and persistent that even the village rainmaker no longer claimed to be able to intervene. He cannot stop the rain now, just as he would not attempt to start it in the heart of the dry season without serious danger to his own health. The personal dynamism required to counter the forces of the extremes of weather would be far too great for the human frame. And so nature was not interfered with in the middle of the rainy season. Sometimes it poured down in such thick sheets of water that earth and sky seemed to merge in one great wetness. It was then uncertain whether the low rumbling of Amidora's thunder came from above or below. At such times, in each of the countless thatched huts of Eumolpia, children sat around their mother's cooking fire telling stories, or with their father on his obi warming themselves from a long fire, roasting and eating the maize. It was a brief resting period between the exacting and arduous planting season and the equally exacting but light-hearted month of harvests. Ikemefuna had begun to feel like a member of Okonkwo's family. He still thought about his mother and his 3-year-old sister, and he had moments of sadness and depression, but he and Noya had become so deeply attached to each other that such moments became less frequent and less poignant. Ikemefuna had an endless stock of folk tales, even those which Noya knew already were told with a new freshness and the local flavor of a different clan. Noya remembered this period very vividly till the end of his life. He even remembered how he had laughed when Ikemefuna told him that the proper name for a corn cob with only a few scattered grains was Ezeagari Nwai, or the teeth of an old friend woman. Noya's mind had gone immediately to Nwayike, who had lived near the Udala tree. She had about 3 teeth and was always smoking her pipe. Gradually, the rains became lighter and less frequent, and earth and sky once again became separate. The rain fell in thin, slanting showers through sunshine and a quiet breeze. Children no longer stayed indoors, but ran about singing. The rain is falling, the sun is shining. Alone, Nadi is cooking and eating. Noya always wondered who Nadi was and why he should live all by himself, cooking and eating. In the end, he decided that Nadi must live in the land of Ikemefuna's favorite story, where the ant holds his court and in splendor, and the sands dance forever. Chapter 5. The feast of the New Yam was approaching, and Eumolpia was in a festival mood. It was an occasion for giving thanks to Ani, the earth goddess and the source of all fertility. Ani played a greater part in the life of the people than any other deity. She was the ultimate judge of morality and conduct, and what was more, she was in close communion with the departed fathers of the clan whose bodies had been committed to earth. The feast of the New Yam was held every year before the harvest began to honor the earth goddess and the ancestral spirits of the clan. New yams cannot be eaten until some had first been offered to these powers. Men and women, young and old, look forward to the New Yam festival because it began the season of plenty, the new year. On the last night before the festival, yams of the old year were all disposed of by those who still had them. The new year must begin with tasty fresh yams and not the shriveled and fibrous crop of the previous year. All cooking pots, calabashes, and wooden bowls were thoroughly washed, especially the wooden mortar in which the yam was pounded. Yam fufu and vegetable soup was the chief food in the celebration. So much of it was cooked that no matter how heavily the family ate or how many friends and relatives they invited from neighboring villages, there was always a large quantity of food left over at the end of the day. The story was always told of a wealthy man who set before his guests a mound of fufu, so high that those who sat on one side cannot see what was happening on the other. And it was not until late in the evening that one of them saw for the first time his in-law who had arrived during the course of the meal and had fallen to on the opposite side. It was only then that they exchanged greetings and shook hands over what was left of the food. The New Yam Festival was thus an occasion for joy throughout Eumolpia, and every man whose arm was strong, as the Igbo people say, was expected to invite large numbers of guests from far and wide. Okonkwo always asked his wife's relations, and since he now had 3 wives, his guests would now make a fairly big crowd. But somehow Okonkwo can never become as enthusiastic over feasts as most people. He was a good eater, and he could drink 1 or 2 fairly big gourds of palm wine. But he was always uncomfortable sitting around for days, waiting for a feast or getting over it. He would be very much happier working on his farm. The festival was now only 3 days away. Okonkwo's wives had scrubbed the walls and the huts with red earth until they reflected light. They had then drawn patterns on them in white, yellow, and dark green. They set about painting themselves with camel wood and drawing beautiful black patterns on their stomachs and on their backs. The children were also decorated, especially their hair, which was shaved in beautiful patterns. The 3 women talked excitedly about the relations who had been invited, and the children reveled in the thought of being spoiled by these visitors from the motherland. Ikemefuna was equally excited. The New Yam Festival seemed to him to be a much bigger event here than in his own village, a place which was already becoming a remote and vague in his imagination. And then the storm burst. Okonkwo, who had been walking about aimlessly in his compound in suppressed anger, suddenly found an outlet. "Who killed this banana tree?" he asked. A hush fell on the compound immediately. "Who killed this tree? Or are you all deaf and dumb?" As a matter of fact, the tree was very much alive. Okonkwo's second wife had merely cut a few leaves off of it to wrap some food, and she said so. Without further argument, Okonkwo gave her a sound beating and left her and her only daughter weeping. Neither of those wives dared to interfere beyond an occasional and tentative. "It is enough," Okonkwo pleaded from a reasonable distance. His anger thus satisfied, Okonkwo decided to go out hunting. He had an old rusty gun made by a clever blacksmith who had come to live in Eumolpia long ago. But although Okonkwo was a great man whose prowess was universally acknowledged, he was not a hunter. In fact, he had not killed a rat with his gun. And so when he called Ikemefuna to fetch his gun, the wife who had just been beaten murmured something about guns that never shot. Unfortunately for her, Okonkwo heard it and ran madly to his room for their loaded gun, ran out again, and aimed at her as she clambered over the dwarf wall of the barn. He pressed the trigger, and there was a loud report, accompanied by the wail of his wife and children. He threw down the gun and jumped into the barn, and there lay the woman, very much shaken and frightened but quite unhurt. He heaved a heavy sigh and went away with the gun. In spite of this incident, the New Yams festival was celebrated with great joy in Okonkwo's household. Early that morning, he was offered a sacrifice of new yam and palm oil to his ancestors. He asked them to protect him, his children, and their mothers in the new year. As the day wore on, his in-laws arrived from 3 surrounding villages, and each party brought with them a huge pot of palm wine. And there was eating and drinking till night, when Okonkwo's in-laws began to leave for their homes. The second day of the new year was the day of the great wrestling match between Okonkwo's village and their neighbors. It was difficult to say which the people enjoyed more, the feasting and fellowship of the first day or the wrestling contest of the second. But there was one woman who had no doubt whatever in her mind. She was Okonkwo's second wife, Ekwefi, whom he nearly shot. There was no festival in all the seasons of the year which gave her as much pleasure as the wrestling match. Many years ago, when she was the village beauty, Okonkwo had won her heart by throwing the cat in the greatest contest within living memory. She did not marry him then because he was too poor to pay her bride price. But a few years later, she ran away from her husband and came to live with Okonkwo. All this happened many years ago. Now, Ekwefi was a woman of 45 who had suffered a great deal in her time. But her love of wrestling contests was still as strong as it was 30 years ago. It was not yet noon on the second day of the New Yam festival. Ekwefi and her only daughter, Azima, sat near her fireplace waiting for the water in the pot to boil. The fowl Ekwefi had just killed was in the wooden mortar. The water began to boil, and in one deft movement she lifted the pot from the fire and poured the boiling water over the fowl. She put back the empty pot on the circular pad in the corner and looked at her palms, which were black with soot. Azima was always surprised that her mother could lift the pot from the fire with her bare hands. Ekwefi, she said, is it true that when people are grown up, fire does not burn them? Azima, unlike most children, called her mother by her name. Yes, replied Ekwefi, too busy to argue. Her daughter was only 10 years old, but she was wiser than her years. But Nuoya's mother dropped her pot of hot soup the other day and it broke on the floor. Ekwefi turned the hen over in the mortar and began to pluck the feathers. Ekwefi, said Azima, who had joined the plucking of the feathers, my eyelid is twitching. It means you are going to cry, said her mother. No, Azima said. It is this eyelid, the top one. It means you will see something. What will I see? She asked. How can I know? Ekwefi wanted her to work it out herself. Oh, said Azima at last. I know what it is. The wrestling match. At last the hand was plucked clean. Ekwefi tried to pull out the horny beak, but it was too hard. She turned around on her low stool and put the beak in her fire for a few moments. She pulled again and it came off. Ekwefi, a voice called from one of the other huts. It was Nuoya's mother, Okonkwo's first wife. Is that me? Ekwefi called back. That was the way people answered calls from the outside. They never answered yes, for fear it might be an evil spirit calling. Will you give Azima some fire to bring me? Her own children and Ikamefuma had gone to the stream. Ekwefi put a few live coals into a piece of broken pot, and Azima carried it across the clean-swept compound to Nuoya's mother. Thank you, Ma, she said. She was peeling new yams, and in a basket beside her were green vegetables and beans. Let me make the fire for you, Azima offered. Thank you, Ezebo, she said. She often called her Ezebo, which means the good one. Azima went outside and brought some sticks from a huge bundle of firewood. She broke them into little pieces across the sole of her foot and began to build a fire, blowing it with her breath. 5 hours. 1 hour. You will blow your eyes out, said Noya's mother, looking up from the yams she was peeling. Use the fan. She stood up and pulled out the fan, which was fastened into one of the rafters. As soon as she got up, the troublesome nanny goat, which had been dutifully eating yam peelings, dug her teeth into the real thing, scooped out 2 mouthfuls, and fled from the hut to chew the cud in the goat's shed. Noya's mother swore at her and settled down again to her peeling. Enzima's fire was now sending up thick clouds of smoke. She went on fanning it until it burst into flames. Noya's mother thanked her and she went back to her mother's hut. Just then the distant beating of the drums began to reach them. It came from the direction of the Ilo, the village playground. Every village had its own Ilo, which was as old as the village itself, and where all the great ceremonies and dances took place. The drums beat the unmistakable wrestling dance, quick, light, and gay, and it came floating on the wind. Okonkwo cleared his throat and moved his feet under the beating of the drums. It filled him with fire, as it has always done from his youth. He trembled with the desire to conquer and subdue. It was like the desire for women. We shall be late for the wrestling, said Nzima to her mother, but they will not begin until the sun goes down. But they are beating the drums. Yes, the drums begin at noon, but the wrestling waits until the sun begins to sink. Go and see if your father has brought out the yams for the afternoon. He has. Noya's mother is already cooking. Go and bring our own then. We must cook quickly, or we shall be late for the wrestling. Nzima ran in the direction of the barn and brought back 2 yams from the dwarf wall. Akwefi peeled the yams quickly. The troublesome nanny goat sniffed about, eating the peelings. She cut the yams into small pieces and began to prepare a pottage, using some of the chicken. At that moment, they heard someone crying just outside their compound. It was very much like Obiageli, Noya's sister. Is that not Obiageli weeping? Akwefi called across the yard to Noya's mother. Yes, she replied. She must have broken her water pot. The weeping was now quite close, and soon the children filed in, carrying on their heads various sizes of pots suitable to their years. Ikemefuna came first with the biggest pot, closely followed by Noya and his 2 younger brothers. Obiageli brought up the rear, her face streaming with tears. In her hand was the cloth pad on which the pot should have rested on her head. What happened? Her mother asked, and Obiageli told her mournful story. Her mother consoled her and promised to buy her another pot. Noya's younger brothers were about to tell her their mother's mother the true story of the accident, which when Ikemefuna looked at them sternly, and they held their peace. The fact that Obiageli had been making inyanga with her pot. She had balanced it on their head, folded her arms in front of her, and began to sway her waist like a grown-up lady. When the pot fell down and stroked, she burst out laughing. She only began to weep when they got near the iroko tree outside their compound. The drums were still beating, persistent and unchanging. Their sound was no longer a separate thing from the living village. It was like the pulsation of its heart. It throbbed in the air, in the sunshine, and even in the trees, and filled the village with excitement. Akwefi ladled her husband's share of the pottage into a bowl and covered it. Nzima took it to him and his obi. Okonkwo was sitting on a goatskin, already eating his first wife's meal. Obiageli, who had brought it from her mother's hut, sat on the floor waiting for him to finish. Nzima placed her mother's dish before him and sat with Obiageli. Sit like a woman, Okonkwo shouted at her. Nzima brought her 2 legs together and stretched them in front of her. Father, will you go to see the wrestling? Nzima asked after a suitable interval. Yes, he answered. Will you go? Yes. And after a pause, she said, Can I bring your chair for you? No, that is a boy's job. Okonkwo was especially fond of Nzima. She looked very much like her mother, who was once the village beauty, but his fondness only showed on very rare occasions. Obiageli broke her pot today, Nzima said. Yes, she has told me about it, Okonkwo said between mouthfuls. Father, said Obiageli, people should talk when they are eating, or a pepper may go down the wrong way. That is very true. Do you hear that, Nzima? You are older than Obiageli, but she has more sense. He uncovered his second wife station and began to eat from it. Obiageli took the first station and returned to her the mother's hut. And then Nkechi came in, bringing the third dish. Nkechi was a daughter of Okonkwo's third wife. In the distance, the drums continued to beat. Chapter 6. The whole village turned out on the Ilo, men, women, and children. They stood around in a huge circle, leaving the center of the playground free. The elders and grandees of the village sat on their own stools, brought there by their young sons or slaves. Okonkwo was among them. All the others stood except those who came by early enough to secure places on the few stands which had been built by placing smooth logs on forked pillars. The wrestlers were not there yet, and the drummers held the field. They too sat just in front of the huge circle of spectators facing the elders. Behind them was the big and ancient silk cotton tree, which was sacred. Spirits of good children lived in that tree waiting to be born. On ordinary days, young women who desired children came to sit under its shade. There were 7 drums, and they were arranged according to their sizes in a long wooden basket. 3 men beat them with sticks, working feverishly from one drum to another. They were possessed by the spirit of the drums. The young men who kept order on these occasions dashed about, consulting among themselves and with the leaders of the 2 wrestling teams, who were still outside the circle behind the crowd. Once in a while, the 2 young men carrying palm fronds ran round the circle and kept the crowd back by beating the ground in front of them, or, if they were stubborn, their legs and feet. At last the 2 teams danced into the circle, and the crowd roared and clapped. The drums rose to a frenzy. The people surged forward. The young men who kept order flew around, waving their palm fronds. Old men nodded to the beat of the drums and remembered the days when they were wrestled to its intoxicating rhythm. The contest began with boys of 15 or 16. There were only 3 such boys in each team. They were not real wrestlers, they merely set the scene. Within a short time, the first 2 bouts were over, but the third created a big sensation, even among the elders who did not usually show their excitement so openly. It was as quick as the other 2, perhaps even quicker, but very few people had ever seen that kind of wrestling before. As soon as the 2 boys closed in, one of them did something which no one could describe because it had been as quick as a flash. And the other boy was flat on his back. The crowd roared and clapped, and for a while drowned the frenzied drums. Okonkwo sprang to his feet and quickly sat down again. 3 young men from the victorious boys' team ran forward, carried him shoulder high, and danced through the cheering crowd. Everybody soon knew who the boy was. His name was Maduka, the son of Obirika. The drummers stopped for a brief rest before the real matches. Their bodies shone with sweat, and they took up fans and began to fan themselves. They also drank water from the small pots and ate kola nuts. They became ordinary human beings again, talking and laughing among themselves with others who stood near them. The air, which had been stretched taut with excitement, relaxed again. It was as if water had been poured on the tightening skin of a drum. Many people looked around, perhaps for the first time, and saw those who stood or sat next to them. "I did not know it was you," Akwefi said to the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with her since the beginning of the matches. "I do not blame you," said the woman. "I had never seen such a large crowd of people. Is it true that Okonkwo nearly killed you with his gun?" "It is true indeed, my dear friend. I cannot yet find a mouth with which to tell the story." "Your chi is very much awake, my friend. And how is my daughter, Nzima?" "She has been very well for some time now. Perhaps she has come to stay." "I think she has. How old is she now?" "She is about 10 years old." "I think she will stay. They usually stay if they do not die before the age of 6. I pray she stays, said Ekwefi with a heavy sigh. The woman with whom she talked was Shiloh. She was the priestess of Agbala, the oracle of the hills and of the caves. The ordinary life, Chilo was a widow with two children. She was very friendly with Ekwefi and shared a common shed in the market. She was particularly fond of Ekwefi's only daughter, Nzima, whom she called my daughter. Quite often, she bought bean cakes and gave Ekwefi some to take home to Nzima. Anyone seeing Shiloh in ordinary life would hardly believe she was the same person who prophesied when the spirit of Abgala was upon her. The drummers took up their sticks and the air shivered and grew tense like a tightened bow. The two teams were arranged facing each other across the clear space. A young man from one team danced across the center to the other side and pointed at whomever he wanted to fight. They danced back to the center together and then closed in. There were 12 men on each side, and the challenge went from one side to the other. Two judges walked around the wrestlers, and when they fought, they were equally matched, sought by them. 5 matches ended this way, but the really exciting moments was when a man was thrown. The huge voice of the crowd then rose to the sky in every direction. It was even heard in the surrounding villages. The last match was between the leaders of the teams. They were among the best wrestlers in all of the 9 villages. Some crowds wondered who would throw the other this year. Some said Okafor was a better man. Others said he was not the equal of Ikazue. Last year, neither of them had thrown the other, even though the judges had allowed the contest to go on longer than the custom. They had the same style, and one saw the other's plans beforehand. It might happen again this year. Dusk was already approaching when their contest began. The drums went mad in the crowds also. They surged forward as the young man danced into the circle. The palm fronds were helpless in keeping them back. Ikazue held out his right hand. Okafor seized it, and they closed in. It was a fierce contest. Ikazue strove to dig in his right heel behind Okafor so as to pitch him backwards in the clever Ega style. But the one knew what the other was thinking. The crowd had surrounded and swallowed up the drummers, whose frantic rhythm was no longer a mere disembodied sound, but the very heartbeat of the people. The wrestlers were now almost still in each other's grip. The muscles on their arms and their thighs and on their backs stood out and twitched. It looked like an equal match. The two judges were already moving forward to separate them when Ikazue, now desperate, went down quickly on one knee in an attempt to fling his man backwards over his head. It was a sad miscalculation. Quick as the lightning of Amadiora, Okafor raised his right leg and swung it over his rival's head. The crowd burst into a thunderous roar. Okafor was swept off his feet by his supporters and carried home shoulder high. They sang his praise, and the young women clapped their hands. Who will wrestle for our village? Okafor will wrestle for our village. Has he thrown 100 men? Has he thrown 400 men? Has he thrown 100 cats? He has thrown 400 cats. Then send him word to fight for us. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. For 3 years, Ikemefu now lived in Okonkwo's household, and the elders of Umuofia seemed to have forgotten about him. He grew rapidly like a yam tendril in the rainy season, and was full of the sap of life. He had become wholly absorbed into his new family. He was like an elder brother to Nuoye, and from this very reason, very first seemed to have kindled a new fire in the younger boy. He didn't feel grown up, and he alone no longer spent the evenings in mother's hut while she cooked, but now sat in with Unkonko in his obi, or watched him as he tapped his palm tree for the evening wine. Nothing pleased Noye now more than to be sent for by his mother or another of his father's wives to do one of those difficult and masculine tasks in the home, like splitting wood or pounding food. On receiving such a message through the younger brother or sister, Noye would feign annoyance and grumble aloud about women and their troubles. Okonkwo was inwardly pleased at his son's development, and he knew it was due to Ikemefuna. He wanted Noye to grow into a tough young man capable of ruling his father's household when he was dead and gone to join his ancestors. He wanted to be a prosperous man, having enough in his barn to feed the ancestors with regular sacrifices. And so he was always happy when he heard him grumbling about women. That showed that in his time he would be able to control his womenfolk. No matter how prosperous a man was, if he was unable to rule his woman and his work and his children, and especially his women, he was not really a man. He was like the man in the song who had 10 and 1 wives and not enough soup for his foo-foo. So Okonkwo encouraged the boys to sit with him in his obi, and he told them stories of the land, masculine stories of violence and bloodshed. Noye knew that it was right to be masculine and to be violent, but somehow he still preferred the stories that his mother used to tell, and which she no doubt still told her younger children. Stories of the tortoise and his wily ways, and of the bird Eneke Oba, who challenged the whole world to a wrestling contest and was finally thrown by the cat. He remembered the story she often told of the quarrel between earth and sky long ago, and how sky withheld rain for 7 years, until crops withered and the dead cannot be buried because the hose broke on the stony earth. At last Vulture was sent to plead with Sky, and to soften his heart with a song of the suffering of the sons to men. Whenever Noye's mother sang this song, he felt carried away to the distant scene in the sky where Vulture, Earth's emissary, sang for mercy. At last Sky was moved to pity, and he gave to Vulture rain wrapped in leaves of cocoyam. But as he flew home, his long talon pierced the leaves, and the rain fell as it had never fallen before. And so heavily did it rain on the Vulture that he did not return to deliver his message, but flew to a distant land, from where he has espied a fire. And when he got there, he found it was a man making a sacrifice. He warmed himself in the fire and ate the entrails. That was the kind of story that Noye loved, but he now knew that they were for foolish women and children, and he knew that his father wanted him to be a man. And so he feigned that he no longer cared for women's stories. And when he did this, he saw that his father was pleased, and no longer rebuked him or beat him. So Noye and Ikemefuna would listen to Okonkwo's stories about tribal wars, or how years ago he had stalked his victim, overpowered him, and obtained his first human head. And as he told them of the past, they sat in darkness or the dim glow of logs, waiting for the women to finish their cooking. When they finished, each brought her bowl of foo-foo and bowl of soup for their husband. An oil lamp was lit, and Okonkwo tasted from each bowl, and then passed 2 shares to Noye and Ikemefuna. In this way, the moons and the seasons passed, and then the locusts came. It had not happened for many a long year. The elders said locusts came once in a generation, reappeared every year for 7 years, and then disappeared for another lifetime. They went back to their caves in the distant land, where they were guarded by a race of stunted men. And then, after another lifetime, these men opened the caves again, and the locusts came to Umofia. They came in the whole harmattan season after the harvests had been gathered, and ate up all the wild grass in the fields. Okonkwo and the two boys were working on the red outer walls of the compound. This was one of the lighter tasks of the after harvest season. A new cover of thick palm branches and palm leaves was set on the walls to protect them from the next rainy season. Okonkwo worked on the outside of the walls and the boys worked from the within. There were little holes from the one side to the other in the upper levels of the wall. And through these, Okonkwo passed a rope, or tai-tai, to boys, and they passed it around the wooden stays and then back to him. And in this way, the cover was strengthened on the wall. The women had gone to the bush to collect firewood, and the little children to visit their playmates into the neighboring compounds. The harmattan was in the air and seemed to distill a hazy feeling of sleep onto the world. Okonkwo and the boys worked in a complete silence, which was only broken when a new palm frond was lifted onto the wall, or when a busy hen moved dry leaves about in her ceaseless search for food. And then, quite suddenly, a shadow fell on the world, and the sun seemed hidden behind a thick cloud. Okonkwo looked up from his work and wondered if it was going to rain at such an unlikely time of the year. But almost immediately, a shout of joy broke out in all directions, and Eumofia, which had dozed in the noonday haze, broke into life and activity. Locusts are descending was joyfully chanted everywhere, and men, women, and children left their work or their play and ran into the open to see the unfamiliar sight. The locusts had not come for many, many years, and only the people had seen them before. At first, a fairly small swarm came. They were the harbingers sent to survey the land. And then appeared on the horizon a slowly moving mass, like a boundless sheet of black cloud drifting towards Eumofia. Soon it covered half the sky, and the solid mass was now broken by tiny eyes of light like shining stardust. It was a tremendous sight, full of power and beauty. Everybody was now about, talking excitedly and praying that the locusts should camp in Eumofia for the night. For although locusts had not visited Eumofia for many years, everybody knew by instinct that they were very good to eat. And at last the locusts did descend. They settled on every tree and on every blade of grass. They settled on the roots and covered the bare ground. Mighty tree branches broke away from under them, and the whole country became the brown earth color of the vast hungry swarm. Many people went out with baskets trying to catch them, but the elders counseled patience till nightfall, and they were right. The locusts settled in the bushes for the night, and their wings became wet with dew. Then all Eumofia turned out in spite of the cold harmattan, and everybody filled with bags and pots with locusts. The next morning they were roasted in clay pots and then spread in sun until they became dry and brittle. And for many days this rare food was eaten with solid palm oil. Okonkwo sat in his obi crunching happily with Ikemefuna and Nwoye, and drinking palm wine copiously, when Ogbuefi Ezuru came in. Ezuru was the oldest man in this quarter of Eumofia. He had been a great and fearless warrior in his time, and was now accorded great respect in all the clan. He refused to join in the meal and asked Okonkwo to have a word with him outside. And so they walked out together, the old man supporting himself with a stick. When they were out of earshot, he said to Okonkwo, That boy calls you father. Do not bear a hand in his death." Okonkwo was surprised and was about to say something when the old man continued. "Yes, Eumofia has decided to kill him. The Oracle of the Hills and the Caves has pronounced Eumofia, as is the custom, and kill him there. But I want you to have nothing to do with it. He calls you his father." The next day, a group of elders from all 9 villages in Eumofia came to Okonkwo's house early in the morning, and before they began to speak in low tones, Nwoye and Ikemefuna were sent out. They did not stay very long, but when they went away, Okonkwo sat still for a very long time, supporting his chin and in his palms. Later in the day, he called Ikemefuna and told him that he was to be taken home the next day. Nwoye overheard it and burst into tears. whereupon his father beat him heavily. As for Echemephuna, he was at a loss. His own home had gradually become very faint and distant. He still missed his father and his sister and would be very glad to see them. But somehow he knew he was not going to see them. He remembered once when men had talked in low tones with his father, and it seemed now as if it was happening all over again. Later, Noia went to his mother's hut and told her that Echemephuna was going home. She immediately dropped her pestle with which she was grinding pepper, folded her arms across her breast and sighed, "Poor child." The next day, the men returned with a pot of wine. They were all fully dressed as if they were going to a big clan meeting or to pay a visit to a neighboring village. They passed their cloths under their right armpits and hung their goatskin bags and, and sheathed machetes over their right shoulders. Okonkwo got ready, and the party set out with Ikemefuna carrying the pot of wine. A deathly silence descended on Okonkwo's compound. Even the very little children seemed to know. Throughout that day, Noya sat in his mother's hut and tears stood in his eyes. At the beginning of the journey, the men of Mufria talked and laughed about the locusts, about their women, and tucked some effeminate men who had refused to come with them. But as they drew near to the outskirts of Mufria, sounds fell upon them too. The sun rose slowly to the center of the sky, and the dry, sandy footway began to throw up the heat that lay buried in it. Some birds chirped and in the forest around. Their men trod dry leaves on the sand. All else was silent. Then from the distance came the faint beating of the equa. It rose and faded with the wind, a peaceful dance from a distant clan. It is an Ozo dance, the men said amongst themselves, but no one was sure where it was coming from. Some said a Zimili, others a Bame or an Aninta. They argued for a short while and fell into silence again, and the elusive dance rose and fell with the wind. Somewhere a man was taking one of the titles of his clan, with music and dancing a great feast. The footway had now become a narrow line in which the heart of the forest, in the heart of the forest, sorry. The short trees and sparse undergrowth which surrounded the men's village began to give way to the giant trees and climbers, which perhaps had stood from the beginning of things, untouched by the axe and the bushfire. The sun streaking through their leaves and branch threw a pattern of light and shade on the sandy footway. Ikemefuna heard a whisper close behind him and turned around sharply. The man who had whispered now had called out aloud, urging the others to hurry up. "We still have a long ways to go," he said. Then he and another man went before Ikemefuna and set a faster pace. Thus the men of Mufia pursued their way, armed with sheathed machetes, and Ikemefuna carrying a pot of palm wine on his head, walked in their midst. Although he had felt uneasy at first, he was not afraid now. Okonkwo walked behind him. He can hardly imagine that Okonkwo was not his real father. He had never been fond of his real father, and at the end of 3 years he had become very distant indeed. But his mother and his 3-year-old sister, of course she would not be 3 now, but 6. Would he recognize her now? She must have grown quite big. How his mother would weep for joy and thank Okonkwo for having looked after him so well and for bringing him back. She would want to hear everything that happened to him in all these 3 years. Could he remember them all? He would tell her about Noia and his mother, and about the locusts. Then, quite suddenly, a thought came upon him. His mother might be dead. He tried in vain to force the thought out of his mind. Then he tried to settle the matter the way he used to settle such matters when he was a little boy. He still remembered the song. I'm going to the bathroom real quick, so I will be back. My voice hurts so much. I have returned. I am stupid. Where did I leave off? Don't worry, y'all. I got this. Ah, there we go. Eze Elina, Sala. Eze Ilikwa, ya. Ikwaba aqua origoli. Eve dandan neche eze. Eve uzuzu nete egu sala. He sang it in his mind and walked to its beat. If the song ended on his right foot, his mother was alive. If it ended on his left, she was dead. No, not dead, but ill. It ended on the right. She was alive and well. He sang the song again, and it ended on the left. But the second time did not count. The first voice gets to Chukwu, or God's house. That was a favorite saying of children. Ikemefuna felt like a child once more. It must be the thought of going home to his mother. One of the men behind him cleared his throat. Ikemefuna looked back, and the man growled at him to go on and not stand looking back. The way he had said it sent cold fear down Ikemefuna's back. His hands trembled vaguely on the black pot he carried. Why had Okonkwo withdrawn to the rear? Ikemefuna felt his legs melting under him, and he was afraid to look back. As the man who had cleared his throat drew up and raised his mustache, Okonkwo looked away. He heard the blow. The pot fell and broke in the sand. He heard Ikemefuna cry, "My father, they have killed me." As he ran towards him, dazed with fear, Okonkwo drew his machete and cut him down. He was afraid of being thought weak. As soon as his father walked in that night, Nwoye knew that Ikemefuna had been killed, and something seemed to give way inside him. Like the snapping of a tightened bow. He did not cry. He just hung limp. He had the same kind of feeling not long ago, during the last harvest season. Every child loved the harvest season. Those who were big enough to carry even a few yams in a tiny basket went with grown-ups to the farm. And if they could not help in digging up the yams, they could gather firewood together for roasting the ones that would be eaten there on the farm. This roasted yam soaked in red palm oil and eaten in the open farm was sweeter than any meal at home. It was after such a day that at the farm during that last harvest that Nwoye had felt for the first time a snapping inside of him, like the one he now felt. They were returning home with baskets of yams from a distant farm across the stream, where they heard the voice of an infant crying in the thick forest. A sudden hush had fallen on the women who had been talking, and they had quickened their steps. Nwoye had heard that twins were put in the earthenware pots and thrown away in the forest, but he had never yet come across them. A vague chill had descended on him, and his head had seemed to swell, like a solitary walker at night who passes an evil spirit on the way. Then something had given way inside of him. It descended on him again, this feeling, when his father walked in that night after killing Ikemefuna. End of chapter 7. I'm cold, so I'm going to wrap myself in a big old blanket. Much better. No. Okay, chapter 8. We are on chapter 8, y'all. Okay. I should write this down. Chapter 8. Okonkwo did not taste any food for 2 days after the death of Ikemefuna. He drank palm wine from morning till night, and his eyes were red and fierce like the eyes of a rat when it was caught by the tail and dashed against the floor. He called his own son, Noya, to sit with him in his obi. But the boy was afraid of him and slipped out of the hut as soon as he noticed him dozing. He did not sleep at night. He tried not to think about Ikemefuna, but the more he tried, the more he thought about him. Once he got up from bed and walked about his compound, but he was so weak that his legs could hardly carry him. He felt like a drunken giant walking with the limbs of a mosquito. Now and then a cold shiver descended on his head and spread down his body. On the third day, he asked his second wife, Ekwefi, to roast plantains for him. She prepared it the way he liked, with slices of oil bean and fish. You have not eaten for 2 days, said his daughter Nzima when she brought him the food to him. So you must finish this. She sat down and stretched her legs in front of her. Okonkwo ate the food absent-mindedly. She should have been a boy, he thought as he looked at his 10-year-old daughter. He passed her a piece of fish. Go and bring me some cold water, he said. Nzima rushed out of the hut, chewing the fish, and soon returned with a bowl of cool water from the earthen pot in her mother's hut. Okonkwo took the bowl from her and gulped the water down. He ate a few more pieces of plantain and pushed the dish aside. Bring me my bag, he asked. And Nzima brought him his goatskin bag from the far end of the hut. He searched it for his snuff bottle. It was a deep bag and took almost the whole length of his arm. It contained other things apart from his snuff bottle. There was a drinking horn in it, and also a drinking gourd, and they knocked against each other as he searched. When he brought out the snuff bottle, he tapped it a few times with his kneecap before taking out some snuff on the palm of his left hand. He then remembered that he had not taken out his snuff spoon. He searched his bag again and brought out a small flat ivory spoon, with which he carried out the brown stuff to his nostrils. Nzima took the dish in one hand and the empty water bowl in the other and went back to her mother's hut. She should have been a boy, Okonkwo said to himself again. His mind went back to Ikemefuna, and he shivered. If only he could find some work to do while he would be able to forget. But it was a season of rest between the harvest and the next planting season. The only work that men did at the time was covering the walls of their compound with new palm fronds, and Okonkwo had already done that. He had finished it on the day the locusts came, when he had worked on one side of the wall, and Ikemefuna and Nwoya on the other. When did you become a shivering old woman? Okonkwo asked himself. You, who are known in all the 9 villages for your valor in war. How can a man who has killed 5 men in battle fall to pieces because he has added a boy to their number? Okonkwo, you have become a woman indeed. He sprang to his feet, hung his goatskin bag on his shoulder, and went to visit his friend Oberika. Oberika was sitting under the shade of an orange tree, making thatches from trees of the raffia palm. He exchanged greetings with Okonkwo and led the way into his obi. I was coming over to see you as soon as I finished that thatch, he said, rubbing off the grains of sand that clung to his thighs. Is it well? Okonkwo asked. Yes, replied Oberika. My daughter's suitor is coming today, and I really hope we will clinch the matter of the bride price. I'd want you to be there. Just then, Oberika's son, Maduka, came into the obi from the outside, greeted Okonkwo, and turned towards the compound. Come and shake hands with me, Okonkwo said to the lad. Your wrestling the other day gave me much happiness. The boy smiled and shook hands with Okonkwo and went to the compound. He will do great things, Okonkwo said. If I had a son like him, I should be happy. I'm worried about Nwoya. A bowl of pounded yams can throw him in a wrestling match. His 2 younger brothers are more promising. But I can tell you, Oberika, that my children do not resemble me. Where are the young suckers that will grow when the old banana tree dies? If Nzima had been a boy, I would have been happier. She has the right spirit. You worry yourself for nothing, said Oberika. Their children are still very young. Nwoya is old enough to impregnate a woman. At his age, I was already fending for myself. No, my friend, he is not too young. A chick that will grow into a cock can be spotted the very day it hatches. I have done my best to make Noye grow into a man, but there's too much of his mother in him, too much of his grandfather, Oberika thought. But he did not say it. The same thought also came to Okonkwo's mind, but he had learned how to lay that ghost. Whenever the thought of his father's weakness and failure troubled him, he expelled it by thinking about his own strength and success. And so he did now. His mind went to his latest show of manliness. I cannot understand why you refused to come with us to kill that boy, he asked Oberika. Because I did not want to. Because I did not want to, Oberika replied sharply. I had something better to do. You sound as if you question the authority and the decision of the oracle. Who said he should die? I do not. Why should I? But the oracle did not ask me to carry out its decision. Someone had to do it. If we were all afraid of blood, it would not be done. And what do you think of the oracle? What do you think the oracle would do then? You know very well, Okonkwo, that I am not afraid of blood. And if anyone tells you that I am, that he is telling a lie. And let me tell you one thing, my friend. If I were you, I would have stayed at home. What you have done will not please the earth. It is the kind of action for which the goddess wipes out whole families. The earth cannot punish me for obeying her messenger, Okonkwo said. A child's fingers are not scalded by a piece of hot yam, which its mother puts into its palm. That is true, Oberika agreed. But if the oracle said that my son should be killed, I would neither dispute it nor be the one to do it. They would have gone on arguing had Ofedu had not come in just then. It was clear from his twinkling eyes that he had important news, but it would be impolite to rush him. Oberika offered him a lobe of the kola nut he had broken with Okonkwo. Ofedu ate slowly and talked about the locusts. When he finished his kola nut, he said, "The things that happen these days are very strange." "What has happened?" asked Okonkwo. "Do you know Obwefi Ndulu?" Ofedu asked. "Obwefi Ndulu of our village," Okonkwo and Oberika said together. "He died this morning," said Ofedu. "That is not strange. He was the oldest man in Ire," said Oberika. "You're right," Ofedu agreed. "But you ought to ask why the drum has not beaten to tell Umofia of his death." "Why?" asked Oberika and Okonkwo together. "That is a strange part of it. You know his first wife who walks with a stick?" "Yes, she is called Ozomena." "That is so," said Ofedu. "Ozomena was, as you know, too old to attend Ndulu during his illness. His younger wives did that. When he died this morning, one of these women went to Ozima's hut and told her. She rose from her mat, took her stick, and walked over to the Obi. She knelt on her knees and hands of the threshold and called her husband, who was laid on the mat. Ogbufi Ndulu, she called 3 times, and went back to her hut. When the youngest wife went to call her again to be present at the washing of the body, she found her lying on the mat, dead. That is very strange indeed, said Okonkwo. They will put off Ndulu's funeral until his wife has been buried. That is why the drum has not been beaten to tell Umofia. It was always said that Ndulu and Ozomena had one mind, said Oberika. I remember when I was a young boy, there was a song about them. He cannot do anything without telling her. I did not know that, said Okonkwo. I thought he was a strong man in his youth. He was indeed, said Ofedu. Okonkwo shook his head doubtfully. He led Umofia to war in those days, said Oberika. Okonkwo was beginning to feel like his old self again. All that he required was something to occupy his mind. If he had killed Ikemefuna during the busy plantation season or harvesting season, it would not have been so bad. His mind would have been centered on his work. Okonkwo was not a man of thought, but of action. But in absence of his work, tugging was the next best. Soon after Ofidu left, Okonkwo took up his goatskin bag to go. I must go home to tap my palm trees for the afternoon, he said. Who taps your tall trees for you? Said Obirka. Umezulik, replied Okonkwo. Sometimes I wish I had not taken the Ozo title, said Obirka. It wounds my heart to see these young men killing palm trees in the name of tapping. It is so indeed. It is so indeed, Okonkwo agreed, but the law of the land must be obeyed. I don't know how we got that law, said Obirka. In many other clans, a man of title is not forbidden to climb the palm tree. Here we say he cannot climb the tall tree, but can tap the short one standing on the ground. It is like Demaranga, who would not lend his knife for cutting up dog meat because the dog was taboo to him, but offered to use his teeth. I think it is good that our clan holds the Ozo title in high esteem, said Okonkwo. And those other clans you speak of, Ozo is so low that every beggar takes it. I was only speaking in jest, so said Obirka. In Abame and Aninita, the title is worth less than 2 cowries. Every man wears the thread of his title on his ankle, and does not lose it even if he steals. They have indeed sold the name of Ozo, said Okonkwo as he rose to go. It will not be very long before my in-laws come, said Obirka. I shall return very soon, said Okonkwo, looking at the position of the sun. Uh, There were 7 men in Obirka's hut when Okonkwo returned. The suitor was a young man of about 25, and with him were his father and uncle. On Obirka's side, there were his 2 elder brothers and Maduka, his 16-year-old son. Ask Akueka's mother to send some kola nuts, said Obirka to his son. Maduka vanished into the compound like lightning. The conversation at once centered around him, and everybody agreed that he was as sharp as a razor. Sometimes I think he is too sharp, said Obirka, somewhat indulgently. He hardly ever walks. He's always in a hurry. If you are sending him on an errand, he flies away before he has heard half of the message. You are very much like that yourself, said his eldest brother. As the people say, when mother cow is chewing grass, its young ones watch its mouth. Manuka has been watching her mouth. As he was speaking, the boy returned, followed by Akueka, carrying his wooden dish with his 3 kola, nuts, and alligator pepper. To give the dish to her father's nuts and alligator pepper. Oh man, this hurts. She gave the dish to her father's eldest brother and then shook hands really shyly. With her suitor and his relatives, she was about 16 and just ripe for marriage. Her suitor and his relatives surveyed her young body with expert eyes as if to assure them that she was beautiful and ripe. She wore a coiffure which was done up into a crest in the middle of the head. Cam wood was rubbed lightly into her skin, and all over her body were black patterns drawn with uli. She wore a black necklace which hung down in 3 coils just above her full succulent breasts. On her arms were red and yellow bangles, and on her waist were 4 or 5 rows of jigida, or waist beads. When she had shaken hands, or rather held out her hand to be shaken, she returned to her mother's hut to help with the cooking. Remove your jigada first, her mother warned as she moved near the fireplace to bring her pestle resting against the wall. Every day I tell you that jigada and fire are not friends. but you will never hear. You grew your ears for decoration, not for healing. One of these days, your jigara will catch fire on your waist, and then you will never know. Akweka moved to the other end of the hut and began to remove the waist beads. It had to be done slowly and carefully, taking each string separately. Else it would break, and the tiny rings would have to be struck together again. She rubbed each string downwards with her palms until it passed the buttocks and slipped down onto the floor and around her feet. Then the obi had already begun to drain the palm wine which Akweka suitor had brought. It was a very good wine and powerful, for in spite of the palm fruit hung across the mouth of the pot to restrain the lively liquor, white foam rose and spilled over. That wine is the work of a good tapper, said Okonkwo. The young suitor, whose name was Ibe, smiled broadly and said to his father, You hear that? He then said to the others, He will never admit that I am a good tapper. He tapped three of my best palm trees to death, said his father, Ugebu. That was about 5 years ago, said Ibe, who had begun to pour out the wine. Before I learned how to tap, he filled, he filled his first horn, and gave to his father. Then he poured out for the others. Okonkwo brought out his big horn from the goat skin bag, and blew into it to remove any dust that might be there, and gave it to Ebed to fill. As the men drank, they talked about everything except the thing for which they had gathered. It was only after the pot that had been emptied that the suitor's father cleared his voice and announced the object of their visit. Ibarika then presented to him a small bundle of short broomsticks. Ukebugu counted them. Are they 30? He asked. Ibarika nodded in agreement. We are at last getting somewhere, Ukebugu said, and then turning to his brother and his son, he said, Let us go out and whisper together. The three rose and went outside. When they returned, Ukebu handed the bundle of sticks back to Obarika and counted them. Instead of 30, there were now only 15. He passed them over to his eldest brother, Machi, who also counted them and said, We had not thought to go below 30. But as the dog said, if I fall down for you and you fall down for me, it is falling down. It is play. Marriage should be a play and not a fight. So we are falling down again. He then added 10 sticks to the 15 and gave the bundle to Ukebu. In this way, Akuka's bride piece was finally settled at 20 bags of cowries. It was already dusk when the two parties came to this agreement. Go and tell Akuka's mother that we have finished, Obarika said to his son Maduka. Almost immediately, the woman came in with a big bowl of fufu. Obarika's second wife followed with a pot of soup, and Maduka brought in a pot of palm wine. As the men ate and drank palm wine, they talked about the customs of their neighbors. It was only this morning, said Obarika, that Okonkwo and I were talking about Abama and Aninta, where titled men climb trees and pound fufu for their wives. All of their customs are upside down. They do not decide bride pieces as well as we do with sticks. They haggle and bargain as if they were buying a goat or a cow in the market. That is very bad, said Obarika's eldest brother. But what is good in one place is bad in another place. In Umunso, they do not bargain at all, not even with broomsticks. The suitor just goes on bringing bags of cowries until his in-laws tell him to stop. It is a bad custom because it always leads to quarrel. The world is large, said Okonkwo. I have even heard that in some tribes a man's children belong to his wife and her family. That cannot be, said Machi. You might as well say that the woman lies on top of the man when they were making the children. It is like the story of the white man who, they say, are white like this piece of chalk, said Obarika. He held up a piece of chalk, which every man kept in his obion, with which his guests drew lines on the floor before they ate kola nuts. And these white men, they say, have no toes. And have you never seen them? Asked Machi. Have you? Said Obarika. One of them passes here quite frequently, said Machi. His name is Amadi. Those who knew Amadi laughed. He was a leper, and the polite name for leprosy was the white skin. For sure. Y'all, I am so tired right now. How can I pause this? I want to pause this. Is that possible? I'm going to take a little break right now. My voice is killing me. I'm watching myself. I think I'm just putting timestamps in the description or something, whatever, of what chapter is when. So yeah, I'll just take breaks between chapters and I'll just go to the timestamp to skip to the next. For now, I'm dying, like badly. So, yep. Can't believe I'm doing this. Why did I agree to this? Chapter 9. For the first time in 3 nights, Okonkwo slept. He woke up once in the middle of the night, and his mind went back to the past 3 days without making him feel uneasy. He began to wonder why he had felt uneasy at all. It was like a man wondering in broad daylight why a man had appeared so terrible to him at night. He stretched himself and scratched his thigh where a mosquito had bitten him as he slept. Another one was wailing near his right ear. He slapped at the ear and hoped he had killed it. Why do they always go for one's ears? When he was a child, his mother has told him a story about it. But it was as silly as all women's stories. Mosquito, she had said, had asked Ear to marry him, whereupon Ear fell on the floor in uncontrollable laughter. How much longer do you think we will live? She asked. You are already a skeleton. Mosquito went away humiliated, and at any time he passed her way, he told Ear that he was still alive. Okonkwo turned to his side and went back to sleep. He was roused in the morning by someone banging on his door. Who is that? He growled. He knew it must be Ekwefi. Of his 3 wives, Ekwefi was the only one who would have the audacity to bang on his door. Enzima is dying, came her voice, and all the tragedy and sorrow of her life were packed in those words. Okonkwo sprang from his bed and pushed back the bolt on his door and ran into Ekwefi's hut. Enzima lay shivering on a mat beside a huge fire that her mother had kept burning all night. It is Iba, said Okonkwo as he took out his machete and went back into the bush to collect the leaves and grasses and barks of trees that went into the making the medicine for Iba. Ekwefi knelt beside the sick child, occasionally feeling her palm with a wet, burning forehead. Enzima was only a child in the center of her mother's world. Very often it was Enzima who decided what food her mother should prepare. Ekwefi even gave her such delicacies as eggs, which children were rarely allowed to eat because such food tempted them to steal. One day, as Enzima was eating an egg, Okonkwo had come in unexpectedly from his hut. He was greatly shocked and swore to beat Ekwefi if she dared to give the child eggs again. But it was impossible to refuse Enzima anything. After her father's rebuke, she developed an even keener appetite for eggs, and she enjoyed above all the secrecy in which she now ate them. Her mother always took her into the bedroom and shut the door. Enzima did not call her mother Ni like all children. She called her by her name, Ekwefi, as her father and other grown-up people did. The relationship between them was not only that of mother and child. There was something in it like the companionship of equals, which was strengthened by such little conspiracies as eating eggs in the bedroom. Ekwefi had suffered a good deal in her life. She had borne 10 children, and 9 of them had died in infancy, usually before the age of 3. As she buried one child after another, her sorrow gave way to despair, and then to grim resignation. The birth of her children, which should be a woman's crowning glory, became for Ekwefi mere physical agony and devoid of promise. The naming ceremony, after several market weeks, became an empty ritual. Her deepening despair found expression in the names she gave her children. One of them was a pathetic cry, Onwumbiko, death, I implore you, but death took no notice. Onwumbiko died in his 15th month. The next child was a girl, Ozemena. May it not happen again. She died in her 11th month, and 2 others after. Ekwefi then became defiant and called her next child Onwuma. Death may please him. And he did. And the death of Ekwefi's second child, Okonkwo had gone to a medicine man, who was also a diviner of the Afa oracle, to inquire what was amiss. This man told him that the child was an Ogbanja, one of those wicked children who, when they died, entered their mother's wombs to be born again. When your wife becomes pregnant again, he said, let her not sleep in her hut. Let her go and stay with her people. In that way, she will elude her wicked tormentor and break its evil cycle of birth and death. Akwefi did as she was asked. As soon as she became pregnant, she went to live with her old mother in another village. It was there that her child was born and circumcised on the 8th day. She did not return to Okonko's compound until 3 days before the naming ceremony. The child was called Onwumbiko. Onwumbiko was not given proper burial when he died. Okonkwo had called in another medicine man who was famous in the clan for his great knowledge about Ogbanja children. His name was Okagbue Uyanwa. Okagbue was a very striking figure, tall, with a full beard and a bald head. He was light in complexion, and his eyes were red and fiery. He always gnashed his teeth as he listened to those who came to consult him. He asked Okonkwo a few questions about the dead child. All the neighbors and relations who had come to mourn gathered round them. On what market day was it born? He asked. Oh, yeah, replied Okonkwo. And it died this morning? Okonkwo said yes, and only realized for the first time that the child had died on the same market day as it had been born. The neighbors and relations also saw the coincidence and said amongst themselves that it was very significant. Where do you sleep with your wife? In your obi or in her own hut? Asked the medicine man. In her hut. In future, call her to your obi. The medicine man then ordered that there should be no mourning for the dead child. He brought out a sharp razor for the goatskin bag slung from his left shoulder and began to mutilate the child. Then he took it away to bury in the evil forest, holding it by the ankle and dragging it on the ground behind him. After such treatment, it would think twice before coming again, unless it was one of the stubborn ones who returned, carrying the stamp of their mutilation, a missing finger, or perhaps a dark line where the medicine man's razor had cut them. By the time Onwumbiko died, Akwefi had become a very bitter woman. Her husband's first wife had already had 3 sons, all strong and healthy. When she had been born, her 3rd son in succession, Okonkwo had slaughtered a goat for her, as was the custom. Akwefi had nothing but good wishes for her, but she had grown so bitter about her own chi that she could not rejoice with others over her good fortune. And so on that day that Nwai's mother celebrated the birth of her 3 sons with feasting and music, Akwefi was the only person in the happy company who went about with a cloud on her brow. Her husband's wife took this for malevolence, and husbands' wives were wont to. How could she know that Akwefi's bitterness did not flow outwards to others, but inwards into her own soul? That she did not blame others for their own good fortune, but for her own evil chi, who denied her any. At last, Enzima was born, and although ailing, she determined to live. At first, Akwefi accepted her, and as she had accepted others, with listless resignation. But when she lived on to her 4th, 5th, and 6th years, love returned once more to her mother, and with love, anxiety. She determined to nurse her child to health, and she put all her being into it. She was rewarded by occasional spells of health during which Enzima bubbled with energy like a fresh palm wine. At such times, she seemed beyond danger, but all of a sudden, she would go down again. Everybody knew she was an Ogbanja. These sudden bouts of sickness and health were typical of her kind, but she had lived so long that perhaps she had decided to stay. Some of them did become tired of her evil rounds of birth and death, or took pity on her mothers instead. Akwefi believed deep inside her that Enzima had come to stay. She believed that it was the faith alone that gave her own life any kind of meaning. And this faith had been strengthened when a year or so ago a medicine man had dug up Enzima's Iyuwa. Everyone knew that she would live because her bond with the world of Banja had been broken. Akwefi was reassured, but such was her anxiety for her daughter that she could not rid herself completely of her fear. And although she believed that the Iwiuwa, which had been dug up, was genuine, she could not ignore the fact that some really evil children sometimes misled people into digging up a suspicious one. But Nzima's Iwiuwa had looked real enough. It was a smooth pebble wrapped in a dirty rag. The the man who dug it up was the same as Okabe, who was famous in Oliver Clan for his knowledge of these matters. Nzima had not wanted to cooperate with him at first, but that was only to be expected. No Ogbanja would yield her secrets easily, and most of them never did because they died too young. Before they could be asked questions, where did you bury your Iyuwa? Okabe had asked Nzima. When she was 9 then, and she was recovering from a serious illness. What is Iyuwa? She asked in return. You know what it is. You bury it in the ground somewhere so that you can die and return again to torment your mother. Nzima looked at her mother, whose eyes, sad and pleading, were fixed on her. Answer the question at once, roared Okonkwo, who stood beside her. All the family were there, and some of the neighbors too. Leave her to me, the medicine man told Okonkwo in a cool, confident voice. He turned again to Nzima. Where do you bury your Iwiuwa? Where they bury children, she replied, and the quiet spectators murmured to themselves. Come along then, and show me the spot, said the medicine man. The crowd set out with Nzima leading the way, and Okagbue following closely behind her. Okonkwo came next, and Ekwefi followed him. When she came into the main road, Nzima turned left as she was going to the stream. But you said it was where they buried children? Asked the medicine man. No, said Nzima, whose feelings of importance was manifest in her sprightly walk. She sometimes broke into a run and stops again suddenly. The crowd followed her silently, women and children returning from the stream with pots of water on their heads, and wondered what was happening until they saw Okawe and guessed that it must be something to do with Okabja. And they all knew Ekwefi and her daughter very well. Let me take a small break. No, actually, I'm fine. When she got to the big Udala tree, Nzima turned left into the bush, and the crowd followed her. Because of her size, she made her way through trees and creepers more quickly than her followers. The bush was alive with the tread of feet on dry leaves and sticks and the moving aside of tree branches. Nzima went deeper and deeper, and the crowd went with her. Then she suddenly turned around and began to walk back to the old road. Everybody stood to let her pass and then followed after her. If you bring us all this way for nothing, I shall beat sense into you, Okonkwo threatened. I have told you to let her alone. I know how to deal with them, said Okagbue. Nzima led the way back to the road, looked left and right, and turned right. And so they arrived home again. Where did you bury your Iwiuwa? Asked Okagbue. When Nzima finally stopped outside her father's obi. Okagbue's voice was changed. It was quiet and confident. It is near that orange tree, Nzima said. And why did you not say so, you wicked daughter of Akalogoli? Okonkwo swore furiously. The medicine man ignored him. Come and show me the exact spot, he said quietly to Nzima. It is here, she said when they got to the tree. Point at the spot with your finger, said Okagbue. It is here, said Nzima, touching the ground with her finger. Okonkwo stood by, rumbling like thunder in the rainy season. Bring me a hoe, said Okagbue. When Ekwefi brought the hoe, he had already put aside his goatskin bag and his big cloth and was in his underwear. A long and thin strip of cloth wound around the waist like a belt and then passed between the legs to be fastened to the belt behind. He immediately set to work digging the pit, where Nzima had indicated. The neighbors sat around watching the pit becoming deeper and deeper. The dark topsoil soon gave way to the bright red earth with which women scrubbed the floors and walls of huts. Okagwe worked tirelessly and in silence, his back shiny with perspiration. Okagwe stood by the pit. He asked Okagwe to come up and rest while he took a hand, but Okagwe said he was not yet tired. Agwefis went into her to cook yams. Her husband had brought out more yams than usual because the medicine man had to be fed. And Zima went with her and helped in preparing the vegetables. There's too much green vegetables, she said. Don't you see the pot is full of yams? Akwefi asked. And you know how leaves become smaller after cooking? Yes, said Nzima. That's why the snake lizard killed his mother. Very true, said Akwefi. He gave his mother 7 baskets of vegetables to cook, and in the end there were only 3, and so he killed her, said Nzima. That is not the end of the story. Oh ho, said Nzima. I remember now. He bought another 7 baskets and cooked them himself. And there were, again, only 3, so he killed himself too. Outside the Obi, Okagwe and Okonkwo were digging to the pit to find where Nzima had buried her Iyuwa. Neighbors sat around watching. The pit was now so deep that they no longer saw the digger. They only saw the red earth as he threw up, mounting higher and higher. Okonkwo's son, Noya, stood near the edge of the pit because he wanted to take in all that happened. Okonkwo had again taken over the digging from Okonkwo. He worked as usual in silence. The neighbors and Okonkwo's wives were now talking. The children had lost interest and were playing. Suddenly, Okonkwo sprang to the surface with the agility of a leopard. It is very near now, he said. I have felt it. There was an immediate excitement, and those who were sitting jumped to their feet. Call your wife and child, he said to Okonkwo. But Akwefi and Nzima had heard the noise and run out to see what it was. Okagwe went back into the pit, which was now surrounded by spectators. After a few more hoefuls of the earth, he struck the Iyuwa. He raised it carefully with the hoe and threw it to the surface. Some women ran away in the fear when it was thrown, but they soon returned and everyone was gazing at the rag from a reasonable distance. Okagwe emerged and without saying a word or even looking at the spectators, he went to his goatskin bag, took out 2 leaves and began to chew them. When he had swallowed them, he took up the rag with his left hand and began to untie it. And then a smooth, shiny pebble fell out. He picked it up. Is it yours? He asked Nzima. Yes, she replied. All the women shouted with joy because Ekwefi's troubles were at last ended. At all this had happened more than a year ago, and Nzima had not been ill since. And then suddenly she had begun to shiver in the night. Ekwefi brought her to the fireplace, spread her mat onto the floor, and built a fire. But she had got worse and worse. As she knelt by her, feeling with her pain the wet, burning forehead, she prayed 1,000 times. Although her husband's wives were saying that it was nothing more than Eva, she did not hear them. Okonkwo returned from the bush, carrying on his left shoulder a large bundle of grasses and leaves, roots and barks of medical trees and shrubs. He went into Ekwefi's hut, put down his load, and sat down. Get me a pot, he said, and leave the child alone. Ekwefi went to bring the pot, and Okonkwo selected the best from his bundle, in their due proportions, and cut them up. He put them in the pot, and Ekwefi poured in some water. Is that enough? He asked when she had poured in about half of the water in the bowl. A little more, I said, a little. Are you deaf? Okonkwo roared at her. She set the pot on the fire, and Okonkwo took up his machete to return to his obi. You must watch the pot carefully, he said as he went, and don't allow it to boil over. If he does, its power will be gone. And went away to his hut, and Ekwefi began to tend the medicine pot almost as if it itself was a sick child. Her eyes went constantly from Nzima to the boiling pot and back to Nzima. Okonkwo returned when he felt the medicine and cooked long and no. He looked over it and said it was done. Bring me a low stool for Nzima, he said, and a thick mat. He took down the pot from the fire and placed it in front of the stool. He then aroused Enzima and placed her on the stool, astride the steaming pot. The thick mat was thrown over both. Enzima struggled to escape from the choking and overpowered steam. But she was held down. She started to cry. When the mat was at last removed, she was drenched in perspiration. Ekwefi mopped her with a piece of cloth, and she lay down on the dry mat and was soon asleep. End of chapter 9. I'm going to take another break, and then I'll be back for chapter 10. Again, I'll have timestamps, so when the actual video is done, y'all can just see and just skip the break parts. Whoa. I'm back. Chapter 10. Oh, come on. Do you expect me to sit down and pee in my seat? I've had to go to the bathroom twice. I finished this bottle, and I'm currently working on this bottle right here. So, I will take one more sip. Yes, oh my god, yes, I'm back. Okay. Yeah, tell a friend. Okay, cool. Let me write this down. Chapter 10. Large crowds began to gather on his village, Ilo, as soon as the edge had worn off the sun's heat, and it was no longer painful on the body. Most communal ceremonies took place at the time of the day, so that even when it was said that a ceremony would begin after the midday meal, everyone understood that it would begin a long time later, when the sun's heat had softened. It was clear from the way the crowd stood or sat that the ceremony was for men. There were many women, but they looked on the fringe like outsiders. The titled men and elders sat on their stools waiting for their trials to begin. In front of them was a row of stools on which nobody sat. There were 9 of them. 2 little groups of people stood at a respectable distance beyond the stools. They faced the elders. There were 3 men in one group and 3 men at one and 1 woman in another. The woman was Mcbuffo, and the 3 men with her were her brothers. In the other group were her husband, Uzawulu, and his relatives. Mcbuffo and her brothers were as still as statues, into whose faces the artist has molded defiance. Uzawulu and his relatives, on the other hand, were whispering together. It looked like whispering, but they were really talking at the top of their voices. Everybody in the crowd was talking. It was like the market. From a distance, the noise was a deep rumble carried by the wind. An iron gong sounded, sending up a wave of expectation in the crowd. Everybody looked in the direction of the Egwugu house. Gome, 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 went the gong. And a powerful flute blew a high-pitched blast. Then came the voices of Egwugu, guttural and awesome. The waves struck the women and children, and there was a backward stampede. But it was momentary. They were already far enough where they stood, and there was room for running away if any of the Egwugu should go towards them. The drum sounded again, and the flute blew. The Egwugu house was now a pandemonium of quavering voices. Aru Oyim de filled the air as the spirits of the ancestors, just emerged from the earth, greeted themselves in their esoteric language. The Egwugu house in which they emerged faced the forest, away from the crowd, who only saw its back with the many colored patterns and drawings done by especially chosen women at regular intervals. These women never saw the inside of the hut. No woman ever did. They scrubbed and painted the outside walls under the supervision of men. If they imagined what it was inside, they kept their imagination to themselves. No woman ever asked questions about the most powerful and the most secret cult in the clan. Aru Oyim de flew around the dark, closed hut like tongues of fire. The ancestral spirits of the clan were abroad. The metal gong beat continuously now, and the flute, shrill and powerful, floated on the chaos. And then the Egwugu appeared. The women and children sent up a great shout and took to their heels. It was indistinctive. A woman fled as soon as the Egwugu came in sight, and when, as on that day, 9 of the greatest masked spirits in the clan came together, and it was a terrifying spectacle. Even Mcbuffo took to their heels and had to be restrained by her brothers. Each of the 9 Egwugu represented a village of the clan. Their leader was called Evil Forest. Smoke poured out of his head. The 9 villages of Imofia had grown out into the 9 sons of their first father of the clan. Evil Forest represented the village of Umeru, or the village of Eru, who was the eldest of the 9 sons. Umofia Kwenu, shouted the leading Egwugu, pushing the air with his raffia arms. The elders of the clan replied, Ya! Umofia Kwenu! Ya! Umofia Kwenu! Ya! Evil Forest then thrust the pointed end of his rattling staff into his earth, and began to shape and rattle like something agitating with a metallic life. He took the first of the empty stools, and the 8 of the other Egwugu began to sit in the order of seniority after him. Okonkwo's wives, and perhaps other women as well, might have noticed that the second Egwugu had this springy walk of Okonkwo. And they might also have noticed that Okonkwo was not among the titled men and elders who sat behind the row of Egwugu. But if they thought these things, they kept them within themselves. The Egwugu with a springy walk was one of the dead fathers of the clan. He looked terrible with a smoked raffia body, a huge wooden face painted with white except for the round hollow eyes and the charred teeth that were as big as a man's fingers. On his head were 2 powerful horns. When all the Egwewu had sat down and the sound of the many tiny bells rattled on their bones had subsided, Evil Forest addressed the two groups of people facing them. Uzowulu's body, I salute you, he said. Spirits always addressed humans as bodies. Uzowulu bent down and touched the earth with his right hand as a sign of submission. Our father, my hand has touched the ground, he said. Uzowulu's body, do you know me? Asked the spirit. How can I know you, father? You are beyond our knowledge. Evil Forest then turned to the other group and addressed the eldest of the three brothers. The body of Udukwe, I greet you, he said. And Udukwe bent down and touched the earth. The hearing then began. Uzowulu stepped forward and presented his case. That woman standing there is my wife, Mbatho. I married her with my money and my yams. I do not owe my in-laws or anything. I owe them no yams. I owe them no cocoa yams. One morning, three of them came to my house, beat me up, and took my wife and children away. This happened in the rainy season. I have waited in vain for my wife to return. At last, I went to my in-laws and said to them, you have taken back your sister. I did not send her away. You yourselves took her. The law of the clan is that you should return her bride prince. But my wife's brothers said that they had nothing to tell me. So I have brought the matter to the fathers of the clan. My case is finished. I salute you. Your words are good, said the leader of the Egwewu. Let us hear Udukwe. His words may also be good. Udukwe was short and thick-set. He stepped forward, saluted the spirits, and began his story. My in-law has told you that we went into his house, beat him up, and took her sister and her children away. All that is true. He told you that he came back to his he came to take back her pride prince, and we refused to give it to him. That is also true. My in-law, Uzowulu, is a beast. My sister lived with him for almost 9 years. During those years, no single day passed in the sky without his beating the woman. We have tried to settle their quarrels time without number, and on each occasion, Uzowulu was guilty. It is a lie, Uzowulu shouted. 2 years ago, continued Udukwe, when she was pregnant, he beat her until she miscarried. It is a lie. She miscarried after she had gone to sleep with her lover. Uzowulu's body, I salute you, said Evil Forest, silencing him. What kind of lover sleeps with a pregnant woman? There was a loud murmur of approbation from the crowd. Udukwe continued. Last year, when my sister was recovering from an illness, he beat her again so that if the neighbors had not gone in to save her, she would have been killed. We heard of it and did as you have been told. The law of Umofia is that if a woman runs away from her husband, her bride price is returned. But in this case, she ran away to save her life. Her 2 children belong to Uzowulu. We do not dispute it. They are too young to leave their mother. If, on the other hand, Uzowulu should return from his madness and come in the proper way to beg his wife to return, she will do so on the understanding that if he ever beats her again, we shall cut off his genitals for him. All right. The crowd roared with laughter. Evil Force rose to his feet, and the order was immediately restored. A steady cloud of smoke rose from his head. He sat down again and called 2 witnesses. They were both Uzowulu's neighbors, and they agreed about the beating. Evil Force then stood up, pulled out his staff, and thrust it into the earth again. He ran a few steps into the direction of the woman. They all fled in terror, only to return to their places almost immediately. The 9 Egwewu then went away to consult together in their house. They were silent for a long time. Then the metal gong sounded, and the flute was blown. The Egwewu had emerged once again from their underground home. They saluted one another and then reappeared on the Ilo. Umofia Quenu, rode Evil Forest, facing the elders and grannies of the children. Yah! Replied the thunderous crowd. The silence descended from the sky and swallowed the noise. Evil Forest began to speak, and all the while he spoke, everyone was silent. The 8 other Aguwu were still as statues. We have heard both sides of the case, said Evil Forest. Our duty is not to blame this man or to praise that, but to settle the dispute. He turned to Uzawolo's group, and allowed a short pause. Uzawolo's body, I salute you, he said. Our father, my hand has touched the ground, replied Uzawolo, touching the earth. Uzawolo's body, do you know me? How can I know you, father? You are beyond our knowledge, Uzawolo replied. I am Evil Forest. I kill a man on the day that his life is sweetest to him. That is true, replied Uzawulu. Go to your in-laws with a pot of wine and beg your wife to return to you. It is not bravery when a man fights with a woman. He turned to Ardukwe and allowed a brief pause. Ardukwe's body, I greet you, he said. My hand is on the ground, replied Okugwe. Do you know me? No man can know you, replied Ojukwe. I am Evil Forest. I am dry meat that fills the mouth. I am fire that burns without faggots. If your in-law brings wine to you, let your sister go with him. I salute you. He pulled his wife from the hard earth and thrust it back. Umofia Quenu, he roared, and the crowd answered. I don't know why such a trifle should come before the Iguwu, said one elder to another. Don't you know what kind of man Uzawulu is? He will not listen to any other decision, replied the other. As he spoke, 2 other groups of people had replaced the first before the Iguwu, and a great land case began. And that was the end of chapter 10, by the way. I'm going to record my time. Okay. Next up, chapter 11. Chapter 11 starts right. Chapter 11. The night was impenetrably dark. The moon had been rising later and later every night until now it was only seen at night. And whenever the moon forsook evening and rose at cockcrow, the nights were as black as charcoal. And Zima and her mother sat on the mat on the floor after their supper of yam, fufu, and bitter leaf soup. A palm oil lamp gave out yellowish light. Without it, it would have been impossible to eat. One could not have known where one's mouth was in the darkness of that night. There was an oil lamp in all the 4 huts on Okonkwo's compound, and each hut, seen from the others, looked like a soft eye of yellow half-light, set in the solid massiveness of night. The world was silent except for the shrill cry of insects, which was part of the night, and the sound of weird mortar and pestle as Nwayika pounded her foo-foo. Nwayika lived 4 compounds away, and she was notorious for her late cooking. Every woman in the neighborhood knew the sound of Nwaki's mortar and pestle. It was also part of the night. Okonkwo had eaten from his wife's dishes and was now reclining with his back against the wall. He searched his bag and brought out his snuffle bottle. He turned it onto his left palm, but nothing came out. He hit the wall against his knee to shake up the tobacco. That was always the trouble with the Okek stuff. It was very quick. It very quickly went damp, and there was too much saltpeter in it. Okonkwo had not bought snuff from him for a long time. Idigo was a man who knew how to grind good snuff, but he had recently fallen ill. Low voices, broken now and again by singing, reached Okonkwo from his wife's huts as each woman and her children told folk stories. Ekwefi and her daughter, Enzima, sat on a mat on the floor. It was Ekwefi's turn to tell a story. Once upon a time, she began, all the birds were invited to a feast in the sky. They were very happy and began to prepare themselves for a great day. They painted their bodies with red camwood and drew beautiful patterns on them with uli. Tortoise saw all of these preparations and soon discovered what it all meant. Nothing happened in the world of the animals ever escaped his notice. He was full of cunning. As soon as he heard of the great feast in the sky, his throat began to itch at the very thought. There was a famine in those days, and Tortoise had not eaten a good meal for 2 moons. His body rattled like a piece of dry steak in his empty shell. So he began to plan how he would go to the sky. But he had no wings, said Enzima. Be patient, replied her mother. This is the story. Tortoise had no wings, but he went to the birds and asked to be allowed to go with them. We know you too well, said the birds when they had heard him. You are full of cunning and you are ungrateful. If we allow you to come with us, you will soon begin your mischief. You do not know me, said Tortoise. I am a changed man. I have learned that a man who takes troubles for others is also taking it for himself. Tortoise had a sweet tongue, and within a short time all the birds agreed that he was a changed man, and each gave him a feather, with which he made 2 wings. At last the great day came, and Tortoise was the first to arrive at the meeting place. When all the birds gathered together, they set off in a body. Tortoise was very happy and voluble as he flew among the birds. He was soon chosen as the man to speak for the party because he was a great orator. There was one very important thing which we must not forget, he said as they flew on their way. When people are invited to a guest feast like this, they take new names for the occasion. Our hosts in the sky will expect us to honor this age-old custom. None of the birds had heard of this custom, but they knew that Tortoise, in spite of all his failings and other decisions, was a widely traveled man who knew the customs of different peoples, and so each took a new name. When they had all taken, Tortoise also took one. He was to be called All of You. At last the party arrived in the sky, and their hosts were very happy to see them. Tortoise stood up in his many-colored plumage and thanked them for their invitation. His speech was so eloquent that all the birds were glad they had brought him, and nodded their heads in approval of all he said. Their hosts took him as the king of the birds, especially as he looked somewhat different from the others. After kola nuts had been presented and eaten, the people of the sky set before their guests the most delectable dishes Tortoise had ever even seen or dreamed of. The soup was brought out hot from the fire, and in the very pot in which it had been cooked. It was full of meat and fish. Tortoise began to sniff aloud. There was pounded yam and also yam pottage cooked with palm oil and fresh fish. There were also pots of palm wine. When everything had been set before the guests, one of the people of the sky came forward and tasted a little from each pot. He then invited the birds to eat, but Tortoise jumped to his feet and asked, For whom had you prepared the feast? For all of you, replied the man. Tortoise turned to the birds and said, You remember that my name is All of You. The custom here is to serve the spokesman first and the others later. They will serve you when I have eaten. He began to eat, and the birds grumbled angrily. The people of the sky thought that it must be their custom to leave all the food for the king. And so Tortoise ate the best part of the food and then drank 2 pots of palm wine, so that he was full of food and drink, and his body filled out in his shell. The birds gathered round to eat what was left and to peck at the bones he had thrown out about the floor. Some of them were too angry to eat. They chose to fly home on an empty stomach. But before they left, each took back the feather he had lent to Tortoise. And there he stood on his hard shell, full of food and wine, but without any wings to fly home. He asked the birds to take a message for his wife, but they all refused. In the end, Parrot, who had felt more angry than the others, suddenly changed his mind and agreed to take the message. Tell my wife, said Tortoise, to bring out all the soft things in my house and cover the compound with them so that I can jump down from the sky without very great danger. Parrot promised to deliver the message and then flew away. But when he reached the tortoise house, he told his wife to bring out all the hard things in the house. So she brought out her husband's hoes, machetes, spears, guns, and even his cannon. Tortoise looked down from the sky and saw his wife bringing things out, but it was too far to see what they were. When all seemed ready, he let himself go. He fell and fell and fell until he began to fear that he would never stop falling. And then the sound of his cannon And then, like the sound of his cannon, he crashed on the compound. Did he die? Asked Nzima. No, replied Akwefi. His shell broke into pieces, but there was a great medicine man in the neighborhood. Tortoise's wife sent for him, and he gathered all the bits in the shell and stuck them together. That is why tortoise shell is not smooth. There is no song in the story, Azim pointed out. No, said Akwefi. I shall think of another one with a song, but it is your turn now. Once upon a time, Nzima began, tortoise and cats went to wrestle against yams. No, that is not the beginning. Once upon a time, there was a great famine in the land of animals. Everybody was lean except Cat, who was fat and whose body shone as if oil was rubbed on it. She broke off because at that very moment, a high-pitched voice broke the outer silence of the night. It was Shilo, the priestess of Agbala, prophesying. There was nothing new in that. Once in a while, Shilo was possessed by the spirit of her god, and she began to prophesy. But tonight, she was addressing her prophecy and greetings to Okonkwo, and everybody in his family listened. The folk story stopped. Agbala ekeneo o, came the voice like a sharp knife cutting through the night. Okonkwo, Agbala ekene gio, Agbala Tolu Ifu Adaya Enzin Mao. At the mention of Enzima's name, Akwefi jerked her head sharply like an animal that had sniffed death in the air. Her heart jumped painfully with her. The priestess had now reached Nkonko's compound and was talking with him outside his hut. She was saying again and again that Agbala wanted to see his daughter, Nzima. Nkonko placed with her to come back in the morning because Nzima was now asleep. But Shilo ignored what he was saying to try to stop him, shouting that Agbala wanted to see her daughter. Her voice was as clear as metal, and Nkonko's women and children heard from their huts all that she said. Nkonko was still pleading that the girl had been ill of late and was asleep. Akwefi quickly took her to their bedroom and placed her on their high bamboo bed. The priestess screamed, "Beware, Nkonko," she warned. "Beware of exchanging words with Agbala. Does a man speak when a god speaks? Beware." She walked through Nkonko's hut into the circular compound and went straight towards Akwefi's hut. Nkonko came after her. "Akwefi," she called. Agbala agreed to. "Where is my daughter, Nzima? Agbala wants to see her." Akwefi came out from her hut carrying her oil lamp in her left hand. There was a light blowing, so she cupped her right hand to shelter the flame. Maria's mother, also carrying an oil lamp, emerged from her hut. The children stood in the darkness outside their hut watching the strange event. Okonkwo's youngest wife also came out and joined the others. "Where does Agbala want to see her?" Akwefi asked. Where else but in his house, in the hills and the caves," replied the priestess. "I will come with you too," Akwefi said firmly. "Tufia'a," the priestess cursed, her voice cracking like the angry bark of thunder in the dry season. "How dare you, woman, to go before the mighty Agbala of your own accord? Beware, woman, lest he strike you in his anger. Bring me my daughter." Akwefi went into her hut and came out again with Nzima. "Come, my daughter," said the princess. "I shall carry you on my back. A baby on its mother's back does not know that the way is long." Enzima began to cry. She was used to Shiloh calling her my daughter, but it was different. Shiloh, it was a different Shiloh she now saw in the yellow half-light. Don't cry, my daughter, said the priestess, lest Agbala be angry with you. Don't cry, said Ekwefi. She will bring you back very soon. I shall give you some fish to eat. She went into the hut again and brought down the smoked black basket in which she kept her dried fish and other ingredients for cooking soup. She broke a piece in two and gave it to Enzima, who clung it to her. Don't be afraid, said Ekwefi, stroking her head, which was shaved in places, leaving a regular pattern of hair. They went outside again. The priestess bent down on one knee, and Enzima climbed on her back. Left palm closed on her fish, and her eyes gleaming with tears. Agbaladu Ekeno. Sheila began once again to chant greetings to her god. She turned around sharply and walked through Okonkwo's hut, bending very low at the eaves. And Azima was crying loudly now, calling on her mother. The two voices disappeared into the thick darkness. A strange and sudden weakness descended on Ekwefi as she stood gazing into the direction of the voices like a hen whose only chick has been carried away by a kite. Enzima's voice soon faded away, and only Sheila was heard moving farther and farther into the distance. Why do you stand there as though she had been kidnapped? Said Okonkwo as he went back to his hut. She will bring her back soon, Moya's mother said. But Ekwefi did not hear these consolations. She stood for a while and then, all of a sudden, made up her mind. She hurried through Okonkwo's hut and went outside. Where are you going? He asked. I am following Shiloh, she replied, and disappeared out into the darkness. Okonkwo cleared his throat and brought out his snuff bottle from the goatskin bag by his side. The priestess' voice was already growing faint in the distance. Ekwefi hurried to the main footpath and turned left in the direction of the voice. Her eyes were useless to her in the darkness, but she picked her way easily into the sandy footpath hedged on either side by branches and damp leaves. She began to run, holding her breast while the hands to stop them flapping noisily against her body. She hit her left foot against an outcropped root, and terror seized her. It was an ill omen. She ran faster, but Sheila's voice was still a long way away. Had she been running too? How could she go so fast with Azima on her back? Although the night was cool, and if Ekwefi was beginning to feel hot from her running, she continually ran into the luxuriant weeds and creepers that walked wild in the path. Once she tripped up and fell. Only then she realized with a start that Sheila had stopped her chanting. Her heart beats violently, and suddenly stood still. Then Sheila's renewed outburst came from only a few paces ahead. But Ekwefi could not shut her eyes for a while and open them again in an effort to see, but it was useless. She could not see beyond her nose. There were no stars in the sky because there was a rain cloud. Fireflies went about her with her tiny green lamps, which only made the darkness more profound. Between Chilo's outbursts and the night was alive and with the shrill tremor of forests and insects woven in the darkness. Agbalado, Ekeno. Ekwefi trudged behind, neither getting too near nor keeping far back. She thought they must be going towards the sacred cave. Now that she walked slowly, she had time to think. What would she do when they got to the cave? She would not dare to enter. She would wait at the mouth, all alone in that fearful place. She thought of all the terrors of the night. She remembered that night long ago when she had seen Agbolayadu, one of those evil essences loosened up upon the world by the potent medicines which the tribe had made in the distant past against its enemies, but had now forgotten how to control. Ekwefi had been running from the stream with her mother on a dark night like this when they saw its glow as it flew in their direction. They had thrown down their water pots and lain by the roadside, expecting the sinister light to descend on them and kill them. That was the only time Ekwefi ever saw Agbuda Agali Adu. But although it had happened so long ago, her blood still ran cold whenever she remembered that night. The priestess' voice came at her at longer intervals now, but its vigor was undiminished. The air was cool and damp with dew. Enzima sneezed. Ekwefi muttered, "Life to you." At the same time, the priestess also said, "Life to you, my daughter." Anzima's voice from the darkness warmed her mother's heart. She trudged slowly, and then the priestess screamed, "Somebody is walking behind me," she said. "Whether you are a spirit or a man, may Agbala shave your head with a blunt razor. May he twist your neck until you see your heels." Akwefi stood rooted to the spot. One mind said to her, "Woman, go home before Agbala does you harm." But she could not. She stood until Sheila had increased the distance between them and began to follow again. She had already walked so long that she began to feel a slight numbness in the limbs and in the head. Then it occurred to her that they could not have been heading for the cave. They must they must have bypassed it long ago. They must be going towards Umachi, the farthest village in the clan. Sheila's voice now came long after long intervals. It seemed to Ekwefi that the night had become a little lighter. The cloud had lifted and the few stars were out. The moon must be preparing to rise, its sullenness over. When the moon rose late again in the night, people said it was refusing for food, as a sullen husband refuses his wife's food when they have quarreled. Agbala du umachi, Agbala kenewuno. It was just as Ekwefi had thought. The priestess was now saluting the village of Umachi. It was unbelievable, the distance they had covered. As they emerged into the open village from the narrow forest trek, the darkness was softened and became possessible to see the vague shape of the trees. Akwefi screwed her eyes up in an effort to see her daughter and the priestess. But whenever she thought she saw their shape immediately dissolved like a melting lump of darkness. She walked numbly along. Shiloh's voice was now rising continuously, and when she first set out, Akwefi had a feeling of a spacious openness, and she guessed they must be on a village islo or playground. And she realized, too, with something like a jerk, that Shiloh was no longer moving forward. She was, in fact, returning. Akwefi quickly moved again from her line of retreat. Chilo passed by, and they began to go back the way they had come. It was a long and a weary journey, and Akwefi felt like a sleepwalker most of the way. The moon was definitely rising, and although it had not yet appeared on the sky, its light had already melted down in the darkness. Akwefi can now discern the figure of the priestess and her burden. She slowed down her pace so as to increase the distance between them. She was afraid what might happen if Chilo suddenly turned around and saw her. She had prayed for the moon to rise, but now she found the half-light of the incipient moon more terrifying than darkness. The world was now peopled with vague, fantastic figures that dissolved under her steady gaze and then formed again in new shapes. At one stage, Akwefi was so afraid that she nearly called out to Chilo for companionship and for human sympathy. What she had seen was the shape of a man climbing the palm tree, his head pointing to the earth and his legs skyward. But at that very moment, Chilo's voice rose again in her possessed chanting, and Akwefi recoiled because there was no humanity there. It was not the same Chilo who sat with her in the market and sometimes bought bean cakes for Nzima, whom she called her daughter. It was a different woman, the priestess of Igbala, the oracle of the hills and caves. Akwefi trudged along between the two fears. The sound of her benumbed steps seemed to come from some other person walking behind her. Her arms were folded across her bare breast. Dew fell heavily, and the air was cold. So she could no longer think, not even about the terrors of night. She just jogged along in a half asleep, only waking up for life when Chilo sang. At last, they took a turning and began to head for the caves. From then on, Sheila never ceased in her chanting. She greeted her God in a multitude of names, the owner of the future, the messenger of earth, the God who cut down a man down when his life was sweetness to him. Akwefi was also awakened when her benumbed fears revived. The moon was now up, and she could see Chilo and Nzima clearly. How a woman could carry a child of that size so easily and for so long was a miracle. But Akwefi was not thinking about that. Chilo was not a woman that night. Agbala Ekenadu. Chi negbu na madu ubosi ndu ya nato ya uto dalur. Akwefi could already see the hills looming in the moonlight. They formed a circular song with breaking at one point through. which the foot track led to the center of the circle. As soon as the priestess stepped into the ring of the hills, her voice was not only doubled in strength, but was thrown back on all sides. It was indeed the shrine of a great god. Ekwefi picked her way carefully and quietly. She was already beginning to doubt the wisdom of her coming. Nothing would happen to Nzima, she thought. And if anything happened to her, could she stop it? She would not dare enter the underground caves. Her coming was quite useless, she thought. As these things went through her mind, she did not realize how close they were to the cave's mouth. And so when the priestess with Nzima on her back disappeared through a hole hardly big enough to pass a hand, Akwefi broke into a run as though to stop them. As though and she as she stood gazing at the circular darkness which she had swallowed them, tears gushed from her eyes, and she swore within her that if she heard Nzima cry, she would rush into the cave to the defender. Against all gods in the world, she would die with her. Having sworn that oath, she sat down on a stony ledge and awaited her. Her fear had vanished. She could hear the priestess' voice, all its metal taken out by the vast emptiness of the cave. She buried her face in her lap and waited. She did not know how long she waited. It must have been a very long time. Her back was turned on the footpath that led out into the hills. She must have heard the noise behind her and turned around sharply. A man stood there with a machete in his hand. Akwefi uttered a scream and sprang to her feet. "Don't be foolish," said Okonkwo's voice. "I thought you were going to the shrine with Sheila," he mocked. Akwefi did not answer. Tears of gratitude filled her eyes, and she knew her daughter was safe. "Go home and sleep," said Okonkwo. "I shall wait here." "I shall wait too. It is almost dawn. The first cock has crowed." As he stood there together, Akwefi's mind went back to the days when they were young. She had married Anene because Okonkwo was too poor then to marry. 2 years after her marriage to Anene, she could bear no longer. She ran away to Okonkwo. It had been early in the morning. The moon was shining. She was going to the stream to fetch water. Okonkwo's house was on the way to the stream. She went in and knocked at his door as he came out. And he came out. Even in those days, he was not a man of many words. He just carried her into this bed, and in the darkness began to feel around her waist for the loose end of her cloth. End of chapter 11. Before we'll take another small break, bathroom break, before going to chapter 12. I'm back. I'm cold. Pretty cold. Okay. Chapter 12 is soon. Let me just set a time to start chapter 12 to 13. Okay. I think I want to stop at the end of part 1. I'm already more than halfway done, by the way. Like, wait, am I? Yeah, I'm more than halfway done. Chapter 12. On the following morning, the entire neighborhood wore a festive air because Okonkwo's friend, Obiriko, was celebrating his daughter's Yuri. It was the day on which her suitor, having already paid the greater part of her bride price, would bring palm wine not only to her parents and immediate relatives, but to the wide and extensive group of kinsmen called Umuna. Everybody had been invited, men, women, and children. But it really was a women's ceremony, and the essential figures were the bride and her mother. As soon as the day broke, the breakfast was hastily eaten, and women and children began to gather at Oberika's compound to help the bride's mother in her difficult but a happy task of cooking for a whole village. Okonkwo's family was assured like any other family in the neighborhood. Nwanye's mother and Okonkwo's youngest wife were already set out for Oberika's compound with all their children. Nwanye's mother carried a basket of cocoa yams and a cake of salt and smoked fish, which she would present to Oberika's wife. Okonkwo's youngest wife, Ojugo, also had a basket of plantains and cocoa yams and small pot of palm oil. Their children carried pots of water. Ekwefi was tired and sleepy from the exhausting experiences of the previous night. It was not very long since they had returned. The priestess, with Nzima sleeping on her back, had crawled out into the strand of the belly like a snake. She had not as much as looked at Okonkwo and Ekwefi or shown any surprise at finding them at the mouth of the cave. She looked straight ahead of her and walked back to the village. Okonkwo and his wife followed at a respectful distance. They thought the priestess might be going to her house, but she went to Okonkwo's compound, passed through his obi and into Ekwefi's hut, and walked into her bedroom. She placed Nzima carefully on the bed and went away without saying a word to anyone. Nzima was still sleeping when everyone else was astir, and Ekwefi asked Nwanye's mother and Njugo to explain to Oberika's wife that she would be late. She had got ready to her basket of cocoa yams and fish, but she must wait for Nzima to wake. You need some sleep yourself, said Nwanye's mother. You look very tired. As he spoke, Nzima emerged from the hut, rubbing her eyes and stretching her spare frame. She saw the other children with their water pots and remembered that they were going to fetch water for Oberika's wife. She went back to the hut and brought her pot. Have you slept well enough? Asked her mother. Yes, she replied. Let us go. Not before you had your breakfast, said Ekwefi, and she went into her hut to warm the vegetable soup she had cooked last night. We shall be going, said Nwanye's mother. I will tell Oberika's wife that you are coming later. And so they all went to help Oberika's wife, Nwanye's mother with her 4 children and Ojugo with her 2. As they trooped through Okonkwo's obi, he asked, who will prepare my afternoon meal? I shall return to do it, said Ojugo. Okonkwo was also feeling tired and sleepy, for although nobody else knew it, he had not slept at all last night. He had felt very anxious but did not show it. When Ekwefi had followed the priestess, he had allowed what he regarded as a reasonable and manly interval to pass and then gone with his machete to the shrine, where he had thought they must be. It was only when he had got there that it had occurred to him that the priestess might have chosen to go around the villages first. Okonkwo had returned home and sat waiting. When he thought he had waited long enough, he had returned to the shrine, but the hills and caves were silent as death. It was only on his 4th trip that he found Ekwefi. and by then he had become gravely worried. Oberika's compound was as busy as an anthill. Temporary cooking tripods were erected on every available space by bringing together 3 blocks of sun-dried earth and making a fire in their midst. Cooking pots went up and down the tripods, and foo was played in 100 wooden mortars. Some of the women cooked the yams and the cassava, and others prepared vegetable soup. Young women pounded the foo, or split firewood. The children made endless trips to the stream. 3 young women helped Obericus to slaughter the 2 goats which the soup was made. They were very fat goats, but the fattest of all was tethered to a peg near the wall of the compound. It was as big as a small cow. Oberica had sent one of his relatives all the way to the Muka to buy that goat. It was the one he would present alive to all his in-laws. The market of Umuka is a wonderful place, said the young man, who had been sent by Oberica to buy the giant goat. There are so many people on it that if you threw a grain of sand, it would not find a way to fall to earth again. It is the result of a great medicine, said Oberica. The people of Umika wanted their market to grow and swallow up their markets of the neighbors. So they made a powerful medicine. Every market day before the first cockcrow, this medicine stands on the market ground in the shape of an old woman was with a fan. With his magic fan, she beckons to the market all the neighboring clans. She beckons in front of her and behind her, to her right and to her left. And so everybody comes, said another man, honest men and thieves. They can steal your cloth from off your waist in the market. Yes, said Oberica, I warned Nawanko to keep a sharp eye and a sharp ear. There was once a man who went to sell a goat. He laid it on a thick rope, which he tied around his waist. But as he walked through the market and realized that people were pointing at him as they do to a madman, he cannot understand it until he looked back and saw that what he led at the end of his tether was not a goat, but a heavy log of wood. Do you think a thief can do that kind of thing single-handed? Asked Nawanko. No, said Oberika. They use medicine. When they had cut the goat's throats and collected the blood in a bowl, they held him over an open fire to burn off the hair, and the smell of burning hair blended with the smell of cooking. Then they washed them and cut for the woman who prepared the soup. All this anthill activity was going smoothly when a sudden interruption came. It was a cry in the distance. Oji, Odu, Achi, Iji, oh! The one that uses its tail to drive flies away. Every woman immediately abandoned whatever she was doing and rushed out into the direction of the cry. We cannot all rush out like that, leaving what we are cooking to burn in the fire, shouted Chilo. The priestess. 3 or 4 of us to stay behind. It is true, said another woman. We will allow 3 or 4 women to stay behind. 5 women stayed behind to look after the cooking posts, and all the rest rushed away to see the cow that had been let loose. When they saw it, they drove it back to its owner, who at once paid a heavy fine with the village. When they saw it, they drove it back to its owner, who at once paid the heavy fine which the village imposed on anyone whose cow was let loose on his neighbor's crops. When the woman had exacted the penalty, she checked among them to see if any woman had failed to come out when the cry had been raised. Where's McBogo? She asked one of them. She is ill in bed, said McBogo's next door neighbor. She has Eva. The only other person is Undekwo, said another woman, and her child is not 28 days yet. Those women whom Oberika's wife had not asked to help her with the cooking returned to their homes, and the rest went back in a body to Oberika's compound. Whose cow was it? Said the woman who had been allowed to stay behind. It was my husband's, said Exelagbo, one of the young women who had opened the gate of the cowshed. Early in the afternoon, the first of the 2 pots of palm wine arrived from Obraka's in-laws. They were duly presented to the women, who drank a cup or two each to help them in their cooking. Some of it also went into the bride and her attendant maidens, who were putting the last delicate touches of a razor to her coiffure and camwood on her smooth skin. When the heat of the sun began to soften, Obraka's son, Maduka, took a long broom and swept the ground in front of her father's obi. And as if they had been awaiting for that, Obraka's relatives and friends began to arrive, every man with his goatskin bag hung on one shoulder and a rolled goatskin bag mat under his arm. Some of them were accompanied by their sons, bearing carved wooden stools. Okonkwo was one of them. They sat in a half circle and began to talk of many things. It would not be long before the suitors came. Okonkwo brought out his snuff bottle and offered it to Oblifi and Zewa, who sat next to him. As Zenwa took it, tapped it on his kneecap, rubbed his left palm on his body to dry it, before tipping a little snuff into it. His actions were deliberate, and he spoke as the performed them. I hope our in-laws will bring many pots of wine. Although they come from a village that is known for being close-fisted, they ought to know what the akwekwe is the bride for a king. They dare not bring fewer than 30 pots, said Okonkwo. I shall tell them my mind if they do. At that moment, Obaraka's son, Maduka, led out the giant goat from the inner compound for his father's relatives to see. They all admired it and said that was the way things should be done. The goat was then led back to the inner compound. Very soon after, the in-laws began to arrive. Young men and boys in a single file, each carrying a pot of wine, came first. Obaraka's relatives counted the pots as they came, 20, 25. There was a long break, and the hosts looked at each other as if to say, I told you. Then more pots came, 30, 35, 40, 45. The hosts nodded in approval and seemed to say, now they are behaving like men, although there were 50 pots of wine. After the pot bearers came Ibe, the suitor, and the elders of the family. They sat in a half moon, thus completing a circle of their hosts. The pots of wine stood in their midst, then the bride, her mother, and half a dozen other women and girls emerged from the inner compound and went round to the inner circle, shaking hands with all. The bride's mother led the way, followed by the bride and the other women. The married women wore their best clothes, and the girls wore red and black waist beads and anklets of brass. When the women retired, Obaraka presented kola nuts to his in-laws. His eldest brother broke the first one. Life to all of us, he said as he broke it, and let there be friendship between your family and ours. The crowd answered, "Ee." We are giving you our daughter today. She will be a good wife to you. She will bear you 9 sons like the mother of her town. Ee. The oldest man in the camp of the visitors replied, it will be good for you and it will be good for us. Yee. This is not the first time my people have come to marry your daughter. My mother was one of you. Yee. And this will not be the last, because you understand us and we understand you. You are a great family. Yee. Prosperous men and great warriors. He looked in the direction of Okonkwo. Your daughter will bear us sons like you. The kola was eaten and the drinking of palm wine began. Groups of 4 or 5 men sat around with a pot in their midst. As the evening wore on, food was presented to their guests. There were huge bowls of fufu and steaming pots of soup. There were also pots of yam pottage. It was a great feast. As nights fell, burning torches were set on wooden tripods, and the young men raised a song. Their elders sat in a big circle, and the singers went around singing man's praise as they came before him. They had something to say for each man. Some were great farmers, some were orators who spoke for the clan. Okonkwo was the greatest wrestler and warrior alive. When they had gone around the circle, they settled down in the center, and girls came from the inner compound to dance. At first, the bride was not among them, but when she finally appeared holding a cock in her right hand, a loud cheer rose from the crowd. All the other dancers made way for her. She presented the cock to the musicians and began to dance. Her brass anklets rattled as she danced, and her body gleamed with camwood and the soft yellow light. The musicians with their wood, clay, and metal instruments went from song to song, and they were all gay. They sang from the latest song of the village. If I hold her hand, she says, don't touch. If I hold her foot, she says, don't touch. But when I hold her waist beads, she pretends not to know. The night was already far spent when the guests rose to go, taking their bride home to spend 7 market weeks in her suitor's family. They sang songs as they went, and on their way they paid short courtesy visits to prominent men like Okonkwo before they finally left for the village. Okonkwo made a present of 2 cocks to them. End of chapter 12. Okay, so a few things to know. First of all, my food has arrived. I will be taking bites out of it. Second of all, third chapter is not that long compared to the other ones. And it's the last chapter in part 1. I think I want to stop after chapter 13 because I'm only finished with part 1. My voice is killing me. And I'm only halfway done with the book. Well, actually, fine. I'm fine. So yeah, I want to be taking a small break real quick. And then I'll continue to chapter 13. My voice is aching right now, like seriously. This is good stuff right here. So I got bread, ham, it's a lot of mayonnaise, and under it, avocado. So that's pretty good. It's a pretty good sandwich, as I do say so myself. Try not to get crumbs all over my blanket. So yeah. Good. Perfect. I will start the next chapter in the next minute. So I won't be just eating the whole time. Don't worry. I wish I could though. I wish I could. It's so good. Okay. Chapter 13. Go dee dee go go dee go. Dee go go dee go. It was the Iqua talking to the clan. One of the things every man learned was the language of the hollowed out wooden instrument. Deem, deem, deem. Boomed the cannon at intervals. The first cock had not crowed, and Eumofia was still swallowed up in sleep and silence when the Iqua began to talk, and the cannon shattered the silence. Men stirred on their bamboo beds and listened anxiously. Somebody was dead. The cannon seemed to rend the sky. Dee go go dee go dee dee go go floated in the message-laden night air. The faint and distant wailing of women settled like a sediment of sorrow on the earth. Now and again, a full-chested lamentation rose above the wailing whenever a man came to the place of death. He raised his voice once or twice in a manly sorrow and then sat down, with the other men listening to the endless wailings of the women in the esoteric language. of the Iqui. Now and again the cannon boomed. The wailing of the wooden would not be heard beyond the village, but the Iqui carried the news to all the 9 villages and even beyond. It began by naming the clan Umofia Obodo Dike, the land of the brave. Umofia Obodo Dike, Umofia Obodo Dike. It was said it said this over and over again as it dwelt on it. Anxiety mounted in every heart that heaved on a bamboo bed that night. Then it went near and named the village Igueto of the Yellow Grinding Stone. It was Okonkwo's village. Again and again, Igueto was called, and men waited breathlessly in all 9 villages. At last, the man was named, and the people sighed. Izudu is dead. A cold shiver ran down Okonkwo's back as he remembered the last time the old man had visited him. That boy calls you father, he said. Bear no hand on his death. Izudu was a great man, and so all the clan was at his funeral. The ancient drums of death beat, guns and cannons were fired. The men dashed about in frenzy, cutting down every tree or animal they saw, jumping over walls and dancing on the roof. It was a warrior's funeral, and from morning till night, warriors came and went in their age groups. They all wore smoked raffia skirts, and their bodies were painted with chalk and charcoal. Now and again, an ancestral spirit or Egwuwu appeared from the underworld, speaking in a tremulous, unearthly voice and completely covered in raffia. Some of them were very violent, and there had been a mad rush for shelter earlier in the day, when one appeared with a sharp machete and was only prevented from doing serious harm by 2 men who restrained him, with the help of a strong rope tied around his waist. Sometimes he turned around and chased those men, and they ran for their lives. But they always returned to the long rope he trailed behind. He sang in a terrifying voice that a Quensu or evil spirit had entered his eye. But the most dreadful of all has yet to come. He was always alone and shaped like a coffin. A sickly odor hung into the air wherever he went, and flies with him. Even the greatest medicine men took shelter when he was near. Many years ago, another Egwuwu had dared to stand his ground before him, and he had been transfixed to the spot for 2 days. This one had only one hand and carried a basket full of water. But some of his Egwuwu were quite harmless. One of them was so old and infirm that he leaned heavily on a stick. He walked unsteadily to the place where the corpse was laid, gazed at it while, and went away to the underworld. The land of the living was not far removed from the domain of the ancestors. There was coming and going between them, especially at festivals and also when an old man died, because an old man was very close to the ancestors. A man's life from birth to death was a series of transition rites which brought him near and near to his ancestors. Izudu had been the oldest man in the village, and at his death there were only 3 men in the whole clan who were older, 4 or 5 others in his own age group. Wherever one of these ancient men appeared in the crowd to dance steadily, the funeral steps of the tribe, younger men gave way and the tumult subsided. It was a great funeral, such as befitted a noble warrior. As the evening drew near, the shouting and firing of guns, the beating of drums, and the brandishing and clanging of machetes increased. Izudu had taken 3 titles of his life. It was a rare achievement. There were only 4 titles in the clan, and only 1 or 2 men of any generation ever achieved the 4th and highest. When they did, they became the lords of the land. Because he had taken titles, Izudu was to be buried after dark, with only a glowing brand to light the sacred ceremony. But before the drums were quite in final rite, the tumult increased tenfold. Drums beat violently, and men leaped up and down in frenzy. Guns were fired on all sides, and sparks flew out as machetes clanked together in warrior salutes. The air was full of dust and the smell of gunpowder. It was then that the one-handed spirit came, carrying a basket full of water. People made his way for him on all sides, and the noise subsided. Even the smell of gunpowder was swallowed in the sickly smell that now filled the air. He danced a few steps to the funeral drums and then went to see the corpse. Izudu, he called in his guttural voice. If you had been poor in your last life, I would have asked you to be rich when you come again. But you were rich. If you had been a coward, I would have asked you to bring courage, but you were a fearless warrior. If you had died young, I would have asked you to get life, but you lived long. So I shall ask you to come away the way you became before. So your death was the death of nature. Go in peace. But if a man caused it, do not allow him a moment's rest. He danced a few more steps and went away. The drums and the drums and the dancing began again and reached fever heat. Darkness was around the corner, and the bureau was near. Guns fired the last salute, and the cannon rent the sky. And then from the center of the delirious fury came a cry of agony and shouts of horror. It was as if the spell had been cast. All was silent. In the center of the crowd, a boy lay on a pool of blood. It was the dead man's 16-year-old son, who, with his brothers and half-brothers, have been dancing the traditional farewell to their father. Okonkwo's gun had exploded, and a piece of iron had pierced the boy's heart. The confusion that followed was without parallel in the tradition of Umofia. Violent deaths were frequent, but nothing like this ever happened. The only course open to Okonkwo was to flee from the clan. It was a crime against the earth goddess to kill a clansman, and a man who committed it must flee from the land. The crime was of two kinds, male and female. Okonkwo had committed the female because it had been inadvertent. He could return to the clan after 7 years. That night he collected his most valuable belongings into headlongs loads. His wives wept bitterly, and their children wept with them without knowing why. Iberica and a half dozen other friends came to help and to console him. They each made 9 or 10 strips carrying Okonkwo's yams to store in Oberica's barn. And before the cock crowed, Okonkwo and his family were fleeing to his motherland. It was a little village called Mabanta, just beyond the borders of Maino. As soon as the day broke out, a large crowd of men from Izuda's quarters stormed Okonkwo's compound, dressed in garbs of war. They set fire to his houses, demolished his red walls, killed his animals, and destroyed his barn. It was a justice of the earth goddess, and they were merely her messengers. They had no hatred in their hearts against Okonkwo. His greatest friend, Oberica, was among them. They were merely cleansing the land which Okonkwo has polluted with the blood of a clansman. Oberica was a man who thought about things. When the will of the goddess had been done, he sat down in his obi and mourned his friend's calamity. Why should a man suffer so grievously for an offense he had committed inadvertently? But although he thought for a long time, he found no answer. He was merely led into greater complexities. He remembered his wife's twin children, whom he had thrown away. What crime had they committed? The earth had decreed that they were an offense on the land and must be destroyed. And if the clan did not exact punishment for an offense as against the great goddess, her wrath was loosened on all land and was not just the offender. As the elder said, if one finger brought oil, it soiled the others. End of part 1. So yeah, I want to stop here. So that was 125 pages out of 209 pages. So that's not that bad. I'm really heavily debating whether I should finish this book right now or leave that till tomorrow, because I've done this. I just need to do this, which is like, I don't know. My voice hurts. I'm in hell. So I'm going to stop this right here. That was part 1. I stammered a lot, so don't take this as an audiobook. Yeah. Thank you for joining me in this journey. I will now finish my amazing sandwich. This thing is great. This thing is great. It's so good. No. Yeah. Thank you, and I'll see you.